Chapter 548. Shwese turned her head and said maliciously, "It's easy to save her. Now that the door is open, you just need to break the mechanism above the stone lotus. The stone lotus will naturally loosen its grip." There was no time to lose. Gong Dai did not dare to chase after them. Saving Gong Yimo was more important. He hurriedly returned to the cave that was about to collapse. Seeing that there were many lotus flowers carved on the stone door, he quickly destroyed them with his sword. The stone was cut off, revealing the complicated mechanism inside. Gong Yimo saw him return and was shocked. "Quickly get out. This place is about to collapse." A sword appeared in her other hand. She clenched her teeth and said, "If there's really no other way, I'll just chop off this hand." If her right hand was chopped off, how could Gong Yimo be Shwese's opponent? Gong Dai did not want her to chop off her hand. He said in a low voice, "Wait a little longer. I will definitely save you." His tone was calm and determined, making Gong Yimo feel more at ease. She racked her brains to think of a way to escape. Large pieces of stone fell down, and the mechanism was made of unknown material. It was very sturdy. Gong Dai used all his strength. Finally, the shaft was cut off. The stone lotus loosened bit by bit. Before Gong Yimo could heave a sigh of relief, she heard a loud cracking sound. The mountain pillar was finally broken by that person. The cave was about to collapse. Gong Yimo had just pulled out her hand when a large piece of stone came crashing down on Gong Yimo. At the critical moment, Gong Dai pushed her forward. That stone smashed into his back and rolled down on his leg. Gong Dai. Gong Yimo turned around and saw Gong Dai spitting out a mouthful of blood and falling to the ground. And at that moment, even larger pieces of stone fell down on his leg and body. Gong Dai. She pounced over like a madwoman, trying to get rid of those stones. But it was useless. Sand and dust filled the air. If she did not leave now, she would be buried by the stones. The cracking sound was incessant. But Gong Yimo could no longer hear it. She couldn't think. She just grabbed his hand and pulled him out. She could not abandon Gong Dai. At this time, the snow outside was also anxious. He shouted, "Hurry up and leave. The mountain is collapsing." Gong Yimo acted as if she did not hear him. Her voice trembled as she said, "Gong Dai. Hold my hand tightly. Don't let go." Gong Yimo was afraid that he would give up, so she begged Gong Dai again and again to hold on to her hand so that she could save him. "Let's go." Gong Dai's entire body was in excruciating pain. He was stuck in the rocks and had no chance to escape. But that wasn't what he was worried about. It was Gong Yimo refusing to let go. The rumbling sound was getting louder and louder. Perhaps it would completely collapse in the next second. Royal sister can't die, she can't die. Why would Gong Yimo listen? The flying sand and stones left countless small wounds on her body. Such a woman who could remain calm even if Mount Tai collapsed on top of her head was actually flustered at this moment. There was only one thought in his mind. She wasn't afraid of death. But she couldn't leave Gong Dai here alone. She couldn't. "Gong Dai. Don't be afraid. I'll save you right away." Although Gong Yimo said that, she was about to cry. Half of the cave had collapsed and she had lost too much blood. She was powerless. How could she save Gong Dai? No. But she couldn't let go. She and Gong Dai's hands were tightly clasped. Her hands were trembling. No. Her entire body was trembling. So many people had died in front of her. Every time, her heart felt like it was going to split open from the pain, but she endured it all. She lived on and continued her unfinished mission. But Gong Dai couldn't. He couldn't. If he died, big drops of tears fell onto their interlocked hand. If he died, how could she live on? Gong Yimo tried to pull him a few times, but in the end, she stumbled and fell to the ground. She wanted to cry out loud, but she knew that crying was useless at this time. She could only pull his hand again and again, letting the big drops of tears fall. But there were so many rocks on Gong Dai's body and he didn't move at all. Gong Dai was seriously injured. The pressure between the rocks made him unable to breathe. He wanted Gong Yimo to leave. The farther the better. But his voice was drowned out by the sound of the collapse. Gong Yimo pretended not to hear him. A few times, The huge rocks brushed past Gong Yimo's head. Gong Dai stared with his eyes wide open. His heart seemed to stop beating. Her tears made his heart ache, but the imminent collapse made him even more frightened. He could die. But royal sister must live. Gong Dai. Woo woo. Gong Dai. Gong Yimo couldn't pull him away. She finally grabbed his hand with all her strength. She felt sticky blood on her fingertips. Her mind was in a mess. She seemed to have lost her rationality. This was the first time she felt so useless. Her brain had crashed. She felt weak all over. Did she have to watch Gong Dai die? Tears blurred her vision. That rock was clearly thrown at her. It was Gong Dai who pushed her, so she didn't die on the spot. How could he be so stupid? He could have lived. Royal sister, Gong Dai suddenly called out to her. He used all his strength to wake Gong Yimo up. His voice made Gong Yimo, who was in a mess, seem to have found her backbone. His unfocused gaze suddenly focused. Then, she saw Gong Dai's face was covered in blood. He was in a sorry state, but his eyes were black and white, like the purest black jade. It was the only home in the world. She couldn't help but go closer and stare into his eyes. Royal sister. Listen to me. Gong Dai held her hand tightly. The corner of his mouth was bleeding, but he seemed to be smiling. At that moment, all the sounds in the surroundings seemed to have disappeared. She could only hear his voice. Royal sister. He gasped for breath. He held Gong Yimo's hand with both hands. His knuckles were white. It was as if every bit of strength represented his entire life. Meeting you. Falling in love with you. I have no regrets. Live on, Momo. After saying that, he gathered the last of his inner strength in his hand. He pushed Gong Yimo. He pushed Gong Yimo into the hands of Snow, who wanted to save her. Gong Dai. Another loud sound was heard. What answered her was a sky full of sand. Don't go. The mountain is going to collapse. Snow hugged her tightly and quickly retreated. The mountain was not going to collapse. It had already collapsed. It was sinking at a speed visible to the naked eye. At that moment, countless thoughts flashed through Gong Yimo's mind. She didn't know where she got the strength, but her lost rationality suddenly returned. Then, she fiercely bit Snow. Snow felt the pain and let go. Gong Yimo ran back like she was flying. Was she crazy? The mountain was going to collapse. Did she want to die? He wanted to chase after her, but the mountain was sinking violently. There were flying sand and rolling stones everywhere. If Gong Yimo ran back, how could she survive? He was unwilling to give up. He gritted his teeth and prepared to charge in. At this moment, huge stones rolled down, blocking his path. The entire mountain rumbled as it sank. Finally, it let out a muffled sound. It crushed the space below it. In an instant, the world was silent. Chapter 549. Snow's hand clenched into a fist. As he dodged the falling rocks, he looked at the mountain with unwillingness. He did not dare to go near. Gong Yimo was definitely dead. There was no point in him going back. What bad luck. He had spent so much effort. In the end, it was all for naught. His eyes flashed with an indescribable expression as he quickly calculated the gains and losses. He had to stay here and wait for the collapse to calm down before digging out Gong Yimo's body. Use her blood to open the door to the treasure. She was dead, but there was still the stone heart. Ordinary saint stones could temporarily affect people who were poisoned, but the conditions were too troublesome. He believed that as long as he had the stone heart, it would be much easier to control those crazy people. Now that Gong Yimo was dead, after he obtained the stone heart, he could still control the emperors of the 4 countries. Although the process was troublesome, there was no other way. If only Gong Yimo was not dead. At this time, a cold laugh came from behind him. Mph, didn't you say it was the world extermination evil spirit? To die so easily, it is really disappointing. Blind held a hammer that was taller than him as he laughed cruelly. Snow quickly put up his guard. He felt that the effect of the poison in his body was gradually fading. It was obvious that his blood had almost detoxified the poison. And the medicine bottle that contained the poison was in Gong Yimo's hands. Now that he met Blind, it was really hard to leave. Blind could not see, but he seemed to feel his condition and laughed lightly. I said, if you want to enter the sacred ground, you have to step over my dead body. Saying that, he waved his huge hammer and pointed it at Snow. They are already dead. Now, it is your turn. Snow knew that he was not Blind's opponent. He could only take advantage of the fact that the poison was still active. He had to find a chance to escape. You are really heartless. You killed Snow Lotus's daughter just like that. Blind laughed coldly when he heard that. His laughter was cold and hard, but it sounded a little depressed. I was born to protect the sacred ground. I am loyal to this land, not you, not Master, and not a Lian. When he said this, a steely determination appeared between his brows. Everyone who wants to disturb this land, only death awaits them. As the two of them spoke, they had already exchanged hundreds of blows. Snow observed that they were currently in the heart of the mountain range. It seemed like no one had set foot in this place for a long time. What he didn't know was that other than the path they came from, there were cliffs on both sides. Behind the blind man was the treasure he yearned for, but Gong Yimo's corpse was buried under a pile of rocks. Snow took a deep breath. Under the effect of the poison goose berserk transformation, his strength had doubled. Thus, when he used his most proficient concealment technique, his entire body seemed to have become one with the wind. Blind frowned. He could not see and could only hear. Other than the sound of the wind, there was nothing else. Suddenly, a faint fragrance of perfume flew past. He took advantage of his victory to pursue and attack. After a few moves, the iron hammer almost smashed into Snow's back. He did not expect the fragrance of Gong Yimo's powder to last so long. As he moved quickly, the fragrance became stronger. Snow cursed inwardly. Damn it. He took off his shoe and smashed it on Blind's face before disappearing again. Blind paused for a moment before continuing to chase. He was not in a hurry. At the end of both sides were cliffs. The only exit was behind him. The direction they came from had collapsed, so it was only a matter of time before he caught Snow. The two of them disappeared while chasing each other. They did not care about Gong Yimo. They felt that Gong Yimo was dead for sure. But was she really dead? In the narrow triangular space, the lotus-carved stone door was still standing. The beast-head stone door that should not have appeared here was lying diagonally on top of it. The two doors formed a stable triangle and a lady was currently gasping for breath. She had one hand on the beast-head stone door while Gong Dai's lower body was stuck in the cracks of the rocks beside the lotus door. Only his upper body was in this narrow triangular space. She made it. Before a huge rock fell, she took out the other half of the stone door from the space and placed it on top of the lotus door. If the beast-head stone door was not firm enough, it would be broken by the huge rock falling from above. Then what awaited the two of them was death. Luckily, after this half of the stone door was hit, it only gave out a dull sound. It did not break. Only then did they have the space to breathe. After the last dull sound, everything returned to normal. Only the lady's violent gasps could be heard clearly in this dead silent space. Gong Dai. The dust made Gong Yimo's voice dry and hoarse. Gong Dai was lying on the ground. The fine sand and stones made him look very miserable. Gong Yimo could not help but pat the sand and stones off his body. She lowered her head to listen to his heartbeat. Still alive. These few words were said by Gong Yimo in a pious tone. She had never felt that she was so lucky. She had never felt so grateful to the heavens. It did not take away Gong Dai. He was by her side. Next, Gong Yimo took out a flashlight from the space and put it aside. She wiped his face with water and fed him some water. After being nourished by the water, Gong Dai gradually woke up. He realized that he was not dead. He was still stuck in the crack of the mountain. Then he opened his eyes in horror. He suddenly grabbed Gong Yimo's hand. Gong Yimo had never seen him lose his composure like this before. That pair of beautiful black eyes were full of blood vessels as he stared at her. It was full of disbelief. You. His throat was dry and hoarse. His organs were in pain. He could not say another word after that. The flashlight illuminated the darkness and Gong Yimo's face. She looked at Gong Dai's eyes as if she wanted to eat him alive. She smiled foolishly. I'm back. Gong Dai grabbed her hand and let it fall weakly. He did not want Gong Yimo to come back. She had lost too much blood and was already weak. If she came back, what else could she do other than die with him? Gong Yimo fed him a little more water. He propped himself up with both hands, and after drinking some more water, he was finally able to speak. Why are you so silly? His voice was hoarse. The ferocity from earlier had faded away. What was left was only heartache and helplessness. You could have lived. Gong Yimo shook her head. Without you, I won't go anywhere. Gong Dai choked. Instantly, he felt a lump in his throat. This might be the most beautiful words of love he had ever heard in his life. Silly, he said dejectedly and angrily. However, his tone was not fierce at all. There was only helplessness, heartache, and sorrow. Gong Yimo knelt on the ground so that he could lie on her lap. Then, she fed him. Her expression was surprisingly tranquil. The little girl who was at a loss before had disappeared, replaced by a determined and calm Gong Ju. Gong Ju was trapped at this time. For a moment, he felt as if he had returned to his childhood when he couldn't even truss a chicken. As for his royal sister, she would never be beaten down, nor would she yield to anyone. But this time, he held Gong Yimo's hand and said seriously, if you have a way, leave first. Don't worry about me. He could feel that his body was being crushed by the huge rock. His meridians and bones were broken. It was not easy for Gong Yimo to leave this place. If she wanted to take him away, she might die here. Gong Yimo stuffed a piece of snack into his mouth. I'll take you away. Chapter 550. Gong Dai was stunned and his heart was filled with bitterness. If he could leave, would he not want to? Even if he became a cripple, he still wanted to live by royal sister's side. However, he knew his current situation too well. With his internal and external injuries, even if royal sister saved him, he would not be able to live for long. Royal sister, his Adam's apple moved as he swallowed the blood in his body and said softly. Gong Yimo quickly grabbed his hand and listened to his voice carefully. You can't leave with me. He knew that Gong Yimo's space was limited and could not fit these stones. However, if she did not care about him, with her intelligence, there would be a chance for her to survive. Gong Yimo lowered her head and played with his fingers as she smiled. Then let's die here together. Gong Dai wanted to persuade her again, but Gong Yimo pressed a finger against his pale lips. I'm serious. Her voice was low and hoarse. There was a kind of exhaustion from losing too much blood, as well as an almost iron-blooded tenacity. Without you, I don't want to live. Her words were stuck in Gong Ju's throat, no matter how much he tried to persuade her. In the end, he seemed to have given up, but also seemed to have regained hope as he said softly, Okay, we live together, and die together. Gong Yimo did not answer and only touched his hair. Now, I'm going to pull you out from the crack in the stone. It might be a little painful. What she did not know was that Gong Dai could no longer feel the existence of his lower body. He nodded. It's okay. Gong Yimo smiled and stuffed a pill into his mouth. It was a great rejuvenation pill. At this time, Gong Dai's body was extremely weak. This strong medicine was used to keep him alive. At the same time, she also ate a red pill. When she left Yu Qi, Sai Wuyan gave her a lot of good things. This pill could improve one's qi and blood. It was originally Dong Luani's private stash. I'm going to do it. Gong Dai nodded slightly. Gong Yimo leaned forward and reached her hand below his thigh. His leg was crushed, but fortunately, it was stuck in the gap and was not directly smashed into meat paste by the huge rock. Gong Yimo's hand reached into the crack and carefully used her inner strength to crush the stone into powder. Her series of actions were very careful. If she was slightly careless, the stone would collapse again and Gong Dai would suffer a second injury. Furthermore, turning stone into powder consumed a lot of inner energy. For her, who had lost too much blood, every time she moved, she would feel pain all over her body. However, her expression did not change, as if the pain did not exist. Gong Yimo used a lot of strength to carefully hollow out a part of the stone beside his knee. Then, she quickly used other stones to support it and continued to reach inside. Although Gong Dai could not see what Gong Yimo was doing, he could feel her hand digging in bit by bit. She was very serious and didn't even notice that her clothes were soaked with sweat. Finally, she dug out enough space for Gong Dai's legs to move. But Gong Dai didn't move at all. She knew that Gong Dai's legs were probably numb. She reached out and touched the stone again. After confirming that there wouldn't be too much resistance to pull Gong Dai out, she said calmly to Gong Dai, "I'll pull you out now. Hug my neck, trust me." When Gong Dai heard this, he blushed but still reached out and hugged her neck. This feeling was just like when they were young. She would always bring him along to steal food. She was petite, and the first time she wanted to use her Qing Gong to carry him, he didn't dare to. He was afraid that she wouldn't be able to bear his weight and would fall. She patted her chest and promised, "Hug me tightly, nothing will happen, trust me. Millimeter, I trust you." Gong Dai's unexpected obedience made Gong Yimo's heart soften. Who would have thought that he, who was as cold as ice in front of others, would have such a soft side? Gong Yimo hugged him and her hands tightened around his waist. Then, she took a deep breath and quickly pulled him out from the stone. At that moment, the stone that was used as a support was knocked down and the cave collapsed once again. Gong Dai pressed on Gong Yimo's body and subconsciously used his body to protect her. The triangular space shook once again. Small stones fell on Gong Dai's body, but he didn't seem to feel it. Finally, the shaking gradually stopped. This small space still existed and they weren't buried by the shaking just now. Chapter 551. Momo. Gong Dai did not realize that he had already come out. He quickly propped himself up to look at Gong Yimo. The flashlight had been smashed by a rock and the space was even narrower than before. In the darkness, Gong Yimo's silence made Gong Dai panic. Momo. After a long while, Gong Yimo coughed softly a few times. Just now, it could be said that she had used up all of her strength. In the end, when she carried Gong Dai out, the back of her head hit the stone door. She only managed to catch her breath after a while. When she touched it, there was indeed a swollen bump. Seeing that Gong Yimo was still alive, Gong Dai was ecstatic. He could not imagine watching Gong Yimo die for him in front of him. That would definitely be the greatest torture before death. At this moment, because of the earthquake, many small rocks had been shaken down, so there were a few cracks that allowed light to shine in. Gong Dai realized that behind the stone door, there was a huge rock pressing down on them. If they could push that rock away and escape before it collapsed again, they would be able to survive. But, who would push that rock away? He reached out and touched Gong Yimo's face. Once again, he had the thought of asking her to give up on him. It was not that he did not want to live, but he was too afraid that she would die. Gong Yimo rested for a moment and sat up. She first touched Gong Dai's leg. Fortunately, although he could not feel it, at least he did not lose anything. It was just that his bones were broken. His serious injuries were internal. If he did not receive treatment in time after the effects of the medicine wore off, his life would be at stake. So she could not wait or rest. She had to get out immediately. Gong Yimo ate a few blood-replenishing pills as if she was eating candy. After sitting for a while, she felt more comfortable and her head was no longer as dizzy. She said, "Later, I will put all the rocks into my space and escape." Gong Dai frowned slightly. "Royal sister, your space is not that big." If it was, she would not have been so flustered earlier. Gong Yimo did not show a trace of uneasiness after being exposed. She said calmly, "You still don't believe me? If I say so, then so be it." Actually, she was lying. Even if she took out all the books in her space, it was impossible for her space to accommodate the huge rock that was pressing down on the stone door. That rock was very long. Judging from the gap, it was even longer than her entire space. There was no way it could fit inside. She pretended to be relaxed and smiled. "I was too panicked before. Have you forgotten? I have so many secrets. It's just a few big stones. I have my ways." Gong Dai was still in disbelief. If there was a way, why didn't he come out earlier? Gong Yimo seemed to understand his thoughts. "It's just that this method is a little taxing, but it'll be fine after a few days." Gong Dai suddenly said, Give me another rejuvenation pill. After you put the stone door into your space, I will hold the boulder outside while you take the opportunity to go out. Gong Yimo smiled. Silly, you might be able to hold on for a while if you weren't injured. Now, you will be crushed to death by the boulder. Gong Dai said seriously, if my death can give you a chance to escape, I will gladly endure it. Gong Yimo could not help but hook her arms around his neck and give him a deep kiss. His mouth was filled with the taste of blood, but it did not matter. She liked this person. Momo. For the first time, Gong Dai backed away from her. In the darkness, a little light shone on his almost transparent face, which was full of seriousness. This is the depths of the mountains. Once the effects of the medicine in my body wear off, I will definitely die. Rather than let you take the risk and let a dying person like me implicate you, why not let you escape alone? Gong Yimo was so angry that she bit his lips. I said, I have a way. Momo, Gong Dai had a premonition that she was going to take the risk. He was afraid that something would happen to her. However, Gong Yimo carried him in her arms like a princess. You said that you want to marry me. Gong Yimo carried him and stood up. She only used one hand to support Gong Dai and ordered Gong Dai to hug her neck tightly. But, no buts. Gong Yimo's other hand supported the stone door with the beast head and laughed softly. You even said that you want to have 2 children. Hearing this sentence at this time, Gong Ju was somewhat discouraged and smiled. Actually, I know that you don't like children. Gong Dai sighed. Put me down. I am already a cripple. I can still buy you some time here. Gong Yimo lowered her head and blocked his words with her mouth. After a while, she raised her head. Although she could not see clearly, Gong Dai felt that her gaze was burning. I don't like children. They are too noisy. She used her lips to gently rub against Gong Dai's thin lips. But if you want, I am willing to give birth to children for you. With that, she took out a jade bottle. If Gong Dai could see clearly, he would know that it was the one that she had snatched from Shue. It was filled with Gu poison. Gong Dai thought that Gong Yimo wanted to take the strong medicine like the Great Rejuvenation Pill and wanted to stop her. However, he was injured internally and externally. How could he stop Gong Yimo? She raised her head and swallowed the remaining 2 pills in the bottle. The taste that was completely different from the Great Rejuvenation Pill made Gong Dai suddenly wake up. Gong Yimo was not eating a tonic. It was Gu poison. Spit it out. Gong Dai suddenly reached out and pinched Gong Yimo's chin. However, he could not stop the Gu poison from melting in her mouth. A kind of heat that seemed to be able to burn one's rationality rose from his abdomen. Gong Yimo stuffed a bottle of medicine into Gong Dai's hand, and said with difficulty, If I go out, I am still in a frenzy. This can save me. Boom. The huge explosion alarmed Blind, who was chasing after Shue. He looked in that direction. Wasn't that the place where Gong Yimo died? Could it be that the mountain was collapsing again? Blind was afraid that the mountain would collapse and crush the entrance of the sacred ground. He hurriedly ran back. Since Shue had nowhere to run, he wanted to see what was happening there. Boom. Boom boom boom. The sound of the explosion did not stop. Shue, who was hiding in the dark, suddenly felt happy. Could it be that Gong Yimo was still alive? Hence, he could not help but run over to check. The closer he got, the stronger the trembling feeling became. Could it be the earth dragon turning over? Blind was the first to reach the foot of the mountain. He could not see, but the flying sand and stones around him and the rising pressure proved that there was a person in front of him. Such a huge commotion was caused by a person. Shue's speed was slower than him. However, when he arrived, the scene in front of him made his eyes widen. His eyeballs seemed to be about to pop out. He saw an extremely large and long boulder being lifted up bit by bit. Because of the movement of the boulder, a small area of the mountain collapsed. Stones continued to fall onto the long boulder. It was smashed until it was unstable, but it was very tenacious as it was lifted up bit by bit. Someone was lifting it. Impossible. How could this be done by human strength? Chapter 552. Blind couldn't help but grip the hammer in his hand tightly. He was born with great strength and profound inner strength. But if it were him, he would only be able to hold on for a moment at most. But there was someone holding up the huge rock. Although he couldn't see, the surging inner strength in his mind was as dazzling as the color of fire. There was a fire burning under the huge rock and it was getting more and more intense. Gong. Gong Yimo. Shwese stared and said those words silently. He was already scared silly and forgot to hide. Blind was on high alert and had no time to pay attention to him. Blind's hand holding the hammer was sweating. He could feel that that person seemed to be Lian's daughter. Why did she suddenly become so powerful? The only explanation was that she had taken the Gu poison. Gong Yimo had already lost her mind. Her eyes were bloodshot. He couldn't see the whites of her eyes, only black and red. Just now when she kept the stone door into her space, the moment the huge rock came crashing down, she held up the huge rock with one hand. Yes, with one hand. She alone, with one hand, held up the huge rock that was about 8 meters long, and with the other hand, she was hugging another person, even though she had already lost her mind. The hand that was hugging him only slightly tightened and didn't strangle him to death. Gong Dai watched as the blood vessels in Gong Yimo's hand burst. It was as if they were about to explode. She knelt on the ground with one knee and channeled all her inner strength into her hand like a tide. But even so, Gong Dai seemed to hear the sound of her bones cracking. All the bones in her body seemed to be shattering, but they were quickly recovering under the strong medicinal effect. The pain of destruction and reconstruction made her face crawl with veins. At first glance, she looked as terrifying as a demon. Blood kept dripping from the corner of her mouth as she held on with her willpower. She held on with all her might. She originally stood up, but the huge rock that fell from the mountain top smashed into the rock she was holding up, causing her feet to sink into the ground, and she knelt down on one knee. Blood and sweat dripped. She suddenly raised her head. She let out a sharp cry. Then, under Gong Dai's incredulous gaze, she stood up again. In a spurt of energy, she overturned the huge rock. The boulders rolled away, and the foot of the mountain lost its support, causing it to collapse once again. Amidst the dust, the rumbling sound deeply stirred everyone's nerves. Blind did not retreat. His heart was pounding. He knew that even if Gong Yimo was still alive, that kind of strength just now would have left her severely injured and on the verge of death. If they didn't kill her now, when her injuries recovered and she went berserk again, no one would be able to stop her. Once the Gu poison flared up, the only way to stop it was to run out of energy. Gong Yimo must be exhausted from the huge commotion just now. Snow was secretly delighted. Was there a better chance to take her down than now? When she and Blind were both injured, he would kill Blind and use Gong Yimo's blood to open the treasure and obtain the stone heart. Then, he would have an invincible killer. Thinking of the power that could destroy heaven and earth. Was that really something a human could possess? Snow's heart thumped wildly. That was the power that he had been pursuing all his life. When the dust dissipated, Gong Yimo hugged Gong Dai. Her entire body was covered in blood. Countless blood vessels on her body had burst. Then the Gu poison was frantically repairing her body, even though her internal organs were all in pain, but there was still a manic murderous intent flowing through her blood vessels. At this moment, Blind had already found her. He swung his hammer over. It was caught by Gong Yimo, who was kneeling on the ground with one hand. Royal sister, this was the first time Gong Dai had witnessed her being injured to such an extent. But his lower body could not feel anything. The medicine in his body was also disappearing bit by bit. He was like a cripple being hugged by her. She had already gone crazy and carefully hugged him in her arms. Perhaps she herself did not understand why she was hugging such a troublesome thing. But there was a voice in her heart telling her she could not let go. Blind could feel that she was heavily injured. Moreover, she seemed to have taken too much Gu poison. As a result, the excess medicine was crazily tearing and repairing her wound. She was in great pain. Blind could feel that she was going crazy from the pain. The two of them engaged in a chaotic battle. Originally, Gong Yimo could have easily killed Blind. But for some unknown reason, she was tightly hugging a person in her arms. She would rather die than let go. Shwese was shocked. He was sure that Gong Yimo had lost her rationality. Why was she still hugging Gong Dai? And Gong Dai, was he still alive? Gong Dai was still alive, but he wished he was dead. Gong Yimo's wounds were being torn open and repaired. The boiling blood fell on his face and burned his heart. He was still so useless. Time and time again, Royal Sister had sacrificed herself for him. He was still too useless. But Gong Yimo had already gone crazy. She could not hear Gong Dai calling her. She only knew that her body was in excruciating pain. She wanted to tear apart those who were still alive. She wanted them to experience this pain. Blind could not hold on any longer. But he could also feel that Gong Yimo's strength was fading. That's right. When she escaped, she had already injured her internal organs. After fighting for so long, she should be exhausted. Just as Blind was secretly heaving a sigh of relief, Gong Yimo seemed to give a strange smile. Her black hair moved without any wind. That blood-soaked white robe seemed to be burning like a raging fire. In the next second, the blind man felt his hammer being grabbed by her hand. She suddenly snatched Blind's weapon. She exerted force in her hand. The black gold handle of the iron hammer broke into two. The next second, he was sent flying by Gong Yimo's kick. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Seeing Gong Yimo approaching step by step, her footsteps were hesitant due to her injuries. But that pair of murderous eyes stared straight at Blind, causing him to shiver. Blind gritted his teeth and suddenly shouted, "Snow Dog. If you don't come out now, she'll kill you after killing me." Snow also felt that Gong Yimo still had some strength left and he was no match for her. So, when he heard Blind's words, he did not hesitate and rushed out. Gong Yimo felt that someone had a death wish, so she immediately grabbed at Snow. But how cunning was Snow? He was just faking it. The real killer move was aimed at Gong Dai, who was in her arms. Gong Yimo was stunned and instinctively protected Gong Dai. So, she was hit by Bloodis Palm and fell to the ground. Blood dripped onto Gong Dai's body. Gong Dai wished he could die at that moment. "Don't bother about me. Don't bother about me. Let me go. Just kill them all." However, Gong Yimo could not hear his voice. Instead, Snow said to Blind proudly, "See that? Attack the person in her arms." Blind stood up and nodded. Both of them attacked Gong Yimo together. This time, their target was Gong Dai. Gong Yimo protected Gong Dai subconsciously every time, allowing the attacks to land on her. How deep did one's feelings have to be to make a crazy person protect another person? Towards the end, Gong Yimo was almost suppressed by both of them. One of them wanted to protect the treasure while the other was lusting after Gong Yimo. They only wanted to defeat Gong Yimo, so they purposely attacked Gong Dai and watched as Gong Yimo blocked the attacks with her body. Chapter 553. Until Gong Yimo was hit by Blind's palm. She retreated backwards and finally knelt on the ground, spitting out a mouthful of blood. That blood sprayed onto Gong Dai's face. At that moment, Gong Dai saw his entire world turn red. Gong Dai could clearly feel that her hands that were hugging him were trembling. That pair of black and red eyes were clearly unfocused, but Gong Dai felt that she was looking at him. She was looking to see if he was still alive and if she had protected him well. A teardrop fell from Gong Dai's temple. At this moment, his heart was torn apart. In his mind, the words that she had once said flashed past. "You are the person that I place at the top of my heart." She had always said that he was very important since young, but there was never a moment like Gong Dai who understood how important he was to her. Her love was not spoken but engraved in her bones. So even if she was crazy, she would not forget it. This was also the person he loved to the bone. At this moment, Blind took advantage of the fact that Gong Yimo was heavily injured and Shuese was not paying attention. He suddenly attacked Gong Yimo to kill her. Shuese wanted to stop him but was blocked by Blind's attack. He wanted Gong Yimo to die. Gong Yimo must not leave this place alive. She could feel his fatal attack coming. Gong Yimo wanted to stand up and dodge, but the next second, her body fell heavily onto the ground. She could no longer stand up. The palm closed in. At the last moment, Gong Yimo did not dodge. Instead, she lowered her head and curled her body up. Once again, She wanted to use her body to protect the person in her embrace. That biting cold palm did not hesitate because of her actions. Instead, it slammed down with even more strength. But the next second, his hand was grabbed by another blood-stained hand. Very tight. Blind was shocked. He could not see, but he seemed to hear the sound of something beating. Plop, plop. Each sound was stronger than the previous one. Shuese crawled up but was frightened by the scene in front of her. She wanted to escape. The surrounding trees suddenly swayed, and with Gong Yimo as the center, it was as though a hurricane was rising. It swept up the sand and stones on the ground. In the blink of an eye, it blotted out the sky. Gong Yimo felt a little strange. She raised her head and saw that the blind man's hand was grabbed by a hand from her bosom. She lowered her head, and in the next second, her vision went black. Someone seemed to lean forward and plant a kiss on her forehead. Blind screams suddenly came from beside his ears because his hand was grabbed by another hand. And that hand was crushing his bones inch by inch. Royal sister, you should rest. Gong Yimo did not understand what he was saying, but she felt his hand touching her hair. Leave the rest to me. In the next second, she felt that her arms were empty. After being stunned for a moment, she subconsciously became agitated. But Shuese saw Gong Dai actually stand up. The bones in his body crackled as impurities and dirty blood seeped out from his body. But his eyes were getting brighter and colder. Gong Dai and Gong Yimo's martial arts would change their meridians and marrow every time they leveled up. Breaking through at this moment, not only did it save Gong Dai's life, it also saved Gong Yimo's life. His black hair fluttered as the blind man's screams continued. Just now, it was this hand that had hit Royal Sister 3 times. Gong Dai's eyes darkened as he exerted strength in his hand. In the next second, the blind man's entire arm was torn off by Gong Dai. He let out a scream. Shuese wanted to run, but it was too late. Previously, he was not Gong Dai's match. Now that Gong Dai had leveled up to the 6th level, he was even less of a match. He did not see how Gong Dai moved, and dozens of stones directly pierced through Shuese's body. He vomited a mouthful of blood and fell to the ground. In the next second, Gong Dai appeared behind him. Just now, it was this person who kept attacking him, causing Royal Sister to subconsciously protect him and take a beating. At that moment, the murderous intent in Gong Dai's eyes seemed to come from hell. Dai. He used his hand as a blade and stabbed down, but a murderous intent came from behind. Gong Dai turned around and realized that the person attacking him was Gong Yimo. Gong Yimo subconsciously thought that this person in front of her had snatched the thing in her arms, so she wanted to kill him. Gong Dai's fatal attack missed. Shuese was seriously injured, but he knew that if he did not leave now, he would not be able to live. He pulled up the similarly injured blind man. This place was so big, so blind man definitely knew a place to hide. Gong Dai really could not care about them. He looked at them gloomily, but Gong Yimo's murderous intent was so strong that he could not escape. Gong Dai did not dare to fight back, but his heart ached for her injuries, so he kept retreating. The two of them kept fighting. Gong Dai suddenly found a pool and subconsciously wanted to pull the furious Gong Yimo into the water. Maybe the water could wake her up. Before Gong Yimo could react, she was pulled by a strong arm, and both of them fell into the pool. In an instant, the water turned red. Gong Yimo had too many injuries on her body. Even though most of them had healed under the effect of the medicine, if she continued to fight like this, it would only aggravate her injuries. After being washed by the water, Gong Yimo seemed to be stunned for a moment. Her face slowly became clean. In the water, her eyes were still black and red, but the veins on her face disappeared and she became fair again. Gong Dai's eyes were overflowing with love. He touched her face, but Gong Yimo pounced on him and fiercely bit him. She bit him very hard, as if she wanted to tear off a piece of flesh. Gong Dai suddenly remembered the medicine that Gong Yimo gave him. She said, if she could not control herself, he should give her the medicine. Gong Dai's heart warmed and his lips curled into a sweet smile. His royal sister seemed to know from the beginning that after she went crazy, she would hurt everyone but him. So, only he could make her take the medicine. Gong Dai did not know what the medicine was, but out of his trust for Gong Yimo, he reached out and grabbed Gong Yimou's chin, forcing her to let go of him. She was instantly unhappy and bared her teeth at him. Her hands even left a few fingerprints on his body. Gong Dai smiled bitterly. "Take the medicine. I'll let you bite me later." He thought that the medicine was something similar to the heart-cleansing pill, so he gave her 2 pills. Slowly, Gong Yimou stopped moving. Gong Dai hugged her and soaked her in the water. Seeing that she was not moving, he was shocked. "Royal sister? Momo." He shook her body in the water, only to see that the blood vessels on her face that had subsided had swelled up again. Her face was very red, so red that it was dripping blood. However, she smelled a very nice man's scent. Her hands explored Gong Dai's body and she became more and more anxious. At that moment, Gong Dai suddenly understood what medicine Gong Yimou had given him. The parasite would only gradually wake up when it was exhausted. Gong Yimou wanted to exhaust her energy, but she did not want to hurt him. So, what Gong Yimou had given him was an aphrodisiac. Before he could react, Gong Yimou pounced on him in the next second. But this time, she did not bite, but kissed. Gong Dai's clothes were instantly torn to pieces. Gong Yimou felt that those disgusting things were very annoying, so it was better to just tear them up. So, not only did she tear his clothes, she also tore her own clothes. The 2 bodies stuck together without any obstruction. That scorching body temperature made Gong Dai tremble. Gong Dai took pity on her injuries and frowned, trying to wake her up. But in the next second, he was tied up by Gong Yimou with his clothes. Chapter 554. The water in the pool was boiling because of Gong Yimou's body temperature. Gong Dai's hands were tied and Gong Yimou was pressing him against the side of the pool. Because she was in a frenzied state, she moved her hands up and down and her actions were urgent, but she did not know where to start. Gong Ju didn't know whether to laugh or cry at this sudden change. His body couldn't withstand the teasing of his beloved. Moreover, he had just been promoted, and his body was full of arrogance. He couldn't wait to vent his anger. He was originally prepared to torture and kill those 2 people to release the fire in his body. However, he was suddenly interrupted by Royal Sister and was moving her hands all over his body. He was really, if Gong Yimou could see clearly, she would realize that the eyes of this delicious food that was being pressed down by her were red. How patient was he? Gong Yimou was nibbling, licking and biting Gong Dai's body. She directly displayed the most primitive impulse, causing Gong Dai's breathing to become erratic. He could not wait to eat her up. However, she had so many injuries on her body. Gong Dai really could not bear to do such a thing to her at this time. Therefore, he suddenly broke free from his hands. Carrying Gong Yimou, he turned around and pressed her against the side of the pool. Gong Yimou was already in a frenzied state. Moreover, she had taken twice the dosage of the aphrodisiac. She was about to explode. However, Gong Dai dilly-dallied and did not let her eat. He even hugged her and pressed her into the water from time to time. At the same time, he said something to her that she could not understand at all. That was so annoying, alright? Baby, Gong Dai panted as he called out to her. He wanted to use the water to wake her up. However, he was getting more and more impatient. His voice was so hoarse that it was almost on fire. He hugged Gong Yimou tightly and pressed her into the water again and again. Again and again, he pulled her up. However, it was all to no avail. Gong Yimou's body was still shockingly hot. Moreover, that warm and soft body without any obstruction made Gong Dai's rationality burn. Baby, calm down. Although he said that, he hugged her even tighter. He couldn't wait to rub her soft body into his. I'm afraid I'll hurt you. I can't help it, baby. If Gong Yimou could understand what he was saying right now, he would definitely scold him. Who asked you to endure it? I'm about to explode, okay? Gong Yimou spared no effort to rub against Gong Dai. She could feel that he was also very aroused, but why did he just hold her and not move? How unbearable. He begged for it but could not get it. Gong Yimou suddenly burst into tears. Sob, sob, sob. She couldn't speak, but because she couldn't move, her body felt like it was going to explode. So, she could only cry to vent. It was hard for her not to forget this trump card even when she was in a frenzy. Gong Dai's heart ached even more. He lowered his head and kissed away her tears, but those tears were like a broken thread, falling non-stop. It was boiling hot, almost burning his lips. At this moment, the two of them had been in the water for so long and had washed themselves clean. Especially Gong Yimo, the wounds on her body had stopped bleeding. Her little face had turned pink because of the aphrodisiac. At this moment, although her eyes were still dark red, the green veins had retreated and her little mouth was pouting. Gong Dai could see the grievance in those terrifying eyes. It really made his heart ache. Gong Dai finally couldn't hold it in anymore. He lowered his head and sucked on her lips. Gong Yimo had also learned her lesson. She didn't bite and bite, instead, she eagerly hugged his head and licked it vigorously. Her legs were also tightly wrapped around Gong Dai, as if she was afraid that he would run away. The two of them were so close together. This stimulation finally made Gong Dai lose his rationality. In a daze, he was still thinking, it should be fine if I'm a little gentler, but his body was more honest than his rationality. The moment he was thinking, he had already straightened his body and rushed in. Gong Yimo instantly let out a scream. The first time shouldn't be so painful. Besides, Gong Dai was already considered gentle. But unfortunately, she was gifted. Gong Yimo cried again. She didn't want to play anymore. Let her go. But how could Gong Dai let her go at this moment? It wasn't easy for him to eat the woman he loved. It hadn't even started yet, alright? So he suppressed his desire to coax her. He kissed her gently again and again. Finally, he felt that Gong Yimo was a little relaxed. But at that time, his eyes were almost as red as Gong Yimo's. A storm began. Gong Dai's movements were very careful. At the beginning, Gong Yimo felt that it was getting more and more interesting. But as the aphrodisiac in her body took effect, she felt dissatisfied. Gong Dai was naturally holding it in. He was afraid that he would hurt her, so he was very gentle. But Gong Yimo started to struggle violently, causing Gong Dai to gasp for air. The strength he used to control her also decreased. Gong Yimo blinked and suddenly broke out of the water with Gong Dai in her arms. She rolled to the side of the grass. In broad daylight, this was too shameful. Gong Dai naturally resisted. He hadn't forgotten that there were two enemies hiding in this place. He couldn't bear to see Gong Yimo being seen by others. But Gong Yimo was on top of him. That ecstasy made Gong Dai's resistance weak. He finally managed to overcome his desire and wanted to drag Gong Yimo into the water. Gong Yimo was dissatisfied and gave him a whip. Wait, where did the whip come from? Gong Yimo was already in a frenzied state. Seeing that the person under her wasn't being obedient, she took things out from her space. But she was still delirious. Not only did she take out the whip, she also took out a lot of other things, like food and clothes. Gong Ju, on the other hand, was stunned. Seeing that he wasn't moving, Gong Yimo was satisfied. She used her own method to satisfy herself. But after a while, Gong Dai came back to his senses. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He tried to snatch her whip. The two of them rolled around. In the end, Gong Yimo had the upper hand. Royal sister, don't, Gong Dai gasped hoarsely. But Gong Yimo saw that he wasn't being obedient and gave him another whip. Royal sister, let go of me. Be obedient, okay. His disobedient royal sister scratched him hard. It made his whole body hot and he almost went crazy. In the end, Gong Dai's eyes were dazed. It wasn't clear whether the words he said were resistance or a desire to resist. Every time he tried to resist, he would be whipped by Gong Yimo. In the end, he would succumb to her gentleness. Although Gong Yimo used a lot of force, Gong Dai couldn't feel any pain under the extreme pleasure. Gong Yimo's actions were a little crazy. But no doubt, this kind of craziness was the best way to relieve desire. The two of them gradually enjoyed the feeling of being one with the person they loved. It was indescribably wonderful. Gong Dai still took pity on Gong Yimo's injuries. Gradually, he didn't dare to resist. But who knew that Gong Yimo didn't seem to know fatigue? Gong Dai then remembered that he had fed Gong Yimo 2 aphrodisiacs. At this moment, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. His body was being pressed down, and she was like a wild beast that never knew how to be satisfied. And he, had actually become the forced party. It had to be said that this experience was really unforgettable for him. Chapter 555. Their lovemaking lasted for the entire afternoon and night. When dawn broke, Gong Yimo seemed to be exhausted and softly fell onto Gong Dai's body. Gong Dai was not satisfied. He turned over and continued the lovemaking. After finally venting, he felt refreshed. After all, they had done it for so long and they had done it many times. He was full, but his poor baby was probably exhausted. He did not want her to be so tired, but she would not be able to calm down if she was not exhausted, so he endured it happily. There were a few times when he wanted to take the initiative, but his body was whipped. Gong Dai could not bear to move too much and hurt her. Fortunately, Gong Yimo's whip was a toy. Although it was painful, there was no blood. Instead, there was a different kind of stimulation. Gong Dai touched Gong Yimo's hair and lovingly held her in his arms. From now on, Royal Sister was his alone. She had finally become his woman. Gong Dai subconsciously looked at her white arm. The chastity mark had long been wiped away. Love flowed in his eyes. He gently kissed her arm with infinite sweetness. When dawn broke, Gong Dai once again carried Gong Yimo to the pool to wash her body. She was really too tired. The water was a little cold in the morning, but she could not feel it. Gong Dai's face was red as he washed her. However, the more he washed her, the more he felt like a beast. He should have restrained himself yesterday. At first, he wanted to press down on Royal Sister to make her restrain herself, but later, he forgot, and she seemed to be injured. After washing, he carried Gong Yimo back to the grass. There were many things that she had thrown out from her space. Among them, there were a few men's clothes that Royal Sister had specially prepared for him. However, there were no women's clothes. Helpless, Gong Dai could only let her wear his clothes. When he thought of his clothes on Royal Sister, he did not know why, but his face turned red again. This man was very strong in some aspects, but when it came to the relationship between a man and a woman, he was very naive. Just his imagination was enough to make his heart beat for half a day. After changing, Gong Dai wrapped the rest of the things in a coat. Royal Sister took out a lot of things, some of which he had never seen before. However, he was afraid that they would be useful, so he did not leave a single one out. After doing all this, he fed her some water. Seeing that she was very weak, he gently transferred his inner energy into her body. Gradually, Gong Yimo's eyebrows relaxed. Gong Dai also could not bear to leave her, and hugged her to sleep. The sky brightened, then darkened again. During this time, Gong Ju carried her to a safe place to find some fresh food. He was afraid that she would be hungry when she woke up. Also, he couldn't find the two men, which made him unhappy. He wanted to find them, then kill them. However, he found that there were cliffs at the end of both sides. The way they came was also blocked. He did not know if the two people left through a safe passage. Gong Dai did not find them. In the end, he came back with water and food, and found that his royal sister was still sleeping. Gong Dai touched her head. Seeing that her body was not hot anymore, his heart relaxed. Then, he went to deal with the rabbit he caught. Unfortunately, there was no seasoning here. He could only take honey and spread it on the rabbit meat. As he roasted it, he thought. He had heard people say that after a woman's first time, they would be very weak and would need to replenish their vitality. Thinking of this, his face turned red again. His eyes lovingly looked at the little person sleeping beside him. He only felt that this was the perfect life. The rabbit meat gradually emitted a charred smell. Gong Dai tore the rabbit meat into pieces and placed them on a big clean leaf. Then, he prepared to wake Gong Yimo up. He gently walked over and lifted Gong Yimo up so that she could use his lap as a pillow. He first fed her some water, then gently called her. "Royal sister?" Gong Yimo slept sweetly. Her face was red, like an attractive apple. Gong Dai gently touched her face and called her again, "Momo? It's time to get up and eat." Gong Dai smiled. After sleeping for so long, it was time to wake up. Furthermore, Royal Sister's breathing was stable. The wounds on her body were rapidly recovering. She should not be so sleepy. However, gradually, Gong Dai's voice became louder, but Gong Yimo was still indifferent. This time, Gong Dai was a little flustered. He touched Gong Yimo's face and felt her pulse. He found that although her body was injured, it was recovering. Why was she not waking up? Gong Dai's expression was solemn. He used water to wipe her face over and over again and called her name. However, Gong Yimo did not respond. Her expression was peaceful, as if she was sleeping. Gong Dai panicked. He once again channeled his inner energy into Gong Yimo's body, but it was like a stone sinking into the sea. There was no response at all. At that moment, he panicked. His remaining rationality told him that he had to leave this damned place immediately and find a famous doctor for Royal Sister. However, this place was blocked on 3 sides. Only the blind man knew the only way out. It was not that he could not find it, but he was afraid that Royal Sister would not be able to wait that long. Therefore, he had to find the blind man now. He had to force him to take them away. Gong Dai carried Gong Yimo and wreaked havoc in this forbidden area. As long as the blind man was still here, it was impossible for him not to know. And in the dark, a person was originally carefully hiding there. However, in the midst of his madness, Gong Dai felt that person's gaze almost immediately. He kicked the person to the ground and found that it was actually Shwese. Upon seeing this person, Gong Dai could not suppress the killing intent in his heart. If not for him, Royal Sister would not have to take the GU poison to save him. However, he was surprised to find that Shwese, who was so severely injured previously, looked like he had recovered by more than half. Could this be the effect of the GU poison? Gong Dai thought to himself. He might as well smash this leader into pieces. He wanted to see if he still had such good healing abilities. When Shwese was discovered by Gong Dai, he was so frightened that his body trembled. At that moment, the torn skin on his face was still pulled over his face. The corners of his mouth were smiling, but his eyes were filled with fear. It was really an indescribably strange scene. He saw that Gong Dai wanted to kill him the moment he saw him. He knew that it was useless to run. Then, he saw Gong Yimo's condition and instantly thought of an idea. He shouted loudly, "Don't tell me you don't want to save her." When he said this, Gong Dai's hand stopped half an inch away from his forehead. He almost had his head smashed by Gong Dai's palm. A drop of cold sweat slid down Shwese's forehead. However, Gong Dai did not stop. He did not dare to wipe it off. His Adam's apple moved. It was very obvious in the night. "Don't you want to save her?" I know a way to save her." Gong Dai hugged Gong Yimo. He was hesitant. This person was full of lies. He obviously could not believe him. However, he was afraid that he really had a way. He was even more afraid that Royal Sister would not be able to hold on for long. Seeing Gong Dai's hesitation, Shwese lowered his body and said softly, "Her condition is very dangerous. If we don't hurry, she will never wake up again." Gong Dai suddenly retracted his hand and stared at the other party with murderous intent. Why is she like this? Chapter 556. Snow heaved a sigh of relief when he saw that he had temporarily saved his life. He carefully observed Gong Dai's expression and said softly, "She should have consumed 2 pieces of GU poison at one go. And it was under the condition that she had lost too much blood. The GU poison's effect is too strong and her body is also weak. After going berserk for so long, she had exhausted her original energy. Under her extremely weak state, her body had accepted the GU poison's original effect." After saying so much, he saw that Gong Dai was slightly impatient, so he spoke quickly. "The GU poison's foundation is the Saint Stone. When a person consumes the Saint Stone powder, they will fall into a deep sleep. Her body had suffered too much damage, so her body automatically chose the other side effect of the GU poison, deep sleep. If you don't think of a solution soon, she will sleep like this for the rest of her life until she dies." Gong Dai was slightly vexed. Indeed, he should have restrained himself yesterday. Royal Sister's body had suffered too much blood loss, and after going berserk, she was already an arrow at the end of its flight. At that time, he should have thought of a way to save her. And not sink into oblivion with her. "You said you have a way." Gong Dai stared coldly at Snow. In that instance, Snow felt as if the death god was staring at him, making him not dare to lie. Yes. Yes. Snow's Adam's apple moved as he swallowed his saliva and said softly, "The treasure deposit is right in front and there is a huge piece of Saint Stone in the treasure deposit. Just place her on the Saint Stone and in a few days' time, she will wake up." When Gong Dai heard that, he narrowed his eyes. Just as Snow heaved a sigh of relief, Gong Dai suddenly took action and crippled one of his arms. Previously he had also crippled one of Snow's arms, but that time he had only sealed his acupoints. Later on, when Snow had gone berserk, that acupoint had naturally opened up. And this time, Gong Dai had directly crushed the meridians in this arm. Snow cried out miserably. Amidst the miserable cries, Gong Dai's voice was especially cold. "You better not be lying to me." Gong Ju looked at Shuese, who was rolling on the ground in pain. His eyes were cold. "Otherwise, I'll let your entire body experience this pain." Snow gritted his teeth fiercely, but he didn't dare to refute. Now that he was on the chopping block, he wouldn't do something so irrational. "Where's the other person?" Gong Ju asked the blind man. Speaking of this, Snow felt angry. He saved the blind man, but after the blind man got better, he suddenly knocked him out and escaped. He should have gone back. Snow was in so much pain that she was gasping for air, but she still managed to speak intermittently. "It's okay. As long as the treasure was opened. He will come back." Gong Dai also felt that there was no need to rush for revenge. The royal sister was more important. There was no time to lose, and he did not dare to delay. He carried Gong Yimo and moved forward quickly. Finally, they arrived in front of the last door. As long as they could open it, they would find the treasure they were looking for. Similarly, this door needed blood to open a path. Gong Dai was afraid that this door would be as greedy as the previous stone door. He carefully bit Gong Yimo's finger and dripped a drop of blood on it. A drop of blood was like breaking the calm surface of a lake. Gong Dai heard the buzzing sound and subconsciously carried Gong Yimo and retreated. What he didn't see was that Snow, who had followed behind him, was looking at the huge stone door which was gradually glowing. She was almost crying tears of joy. So many years. He had waited for this day to come. That huge stone door, which was as tall as 3 people, was buzzing and trembling. Countless fine sand and stone powder fell from the gap of the door. In the darkness, that door gradually emitted a fluorescent light, giving off an indescribable feeling of strangeness. Gong Dai carried Gong Yimo and stood in front of the door, fearless. As long as he could save her, he was willing to try anything and dared to charge into any place. The buzzing sound became louder and louder, causing the ground to tremble. A gust of wind appeared and that huge stone door opened up a small gap. This treasure was built by hollowing out a small mountain. When the door opened a crack, Gong Ju's eyes seemed to be filled with hallucinations. The surroundings seemed to be brightly lit, and people were constantly coming in and out. They were holding different things in their hands, such as medicine bottles, animal corpses, and other things. Everyone looked hurried, as if they were doing something important. When the door opened bit by bit, the illusion disappeared. There were no lights around, only moonlight. The huge door emitted a fluorescent light, and light seeped out from the gap of the door. It was slowly opening. The first thing that floated out was not the smell of decay, but the fragrance of medicine. Gong Dai held his breath and walked in without turning back. He thought that the light inside was an illusion, but he never expected that after walking in, he would find many luminous pearls embedded in the walls on both sides. And under the arch of the luminous pearls, a huge black stone appeared in front of him. Just as Snow had said, in the huge black stone bed, there was a red object that glowed. Gong Dai hesitated for a moment, but resolutely walked over. He did not forget that Snow was still outside, so he used his inner strength and the huge stone door closed. The room was sealed once again. He walked forward step by step and gently placed Gong Yimo on the stone bed. After he did this, he realized that everything in front of him had changed. It had turned into a brightly lit wedding night, and his beloved woman was looking at him with a smile. She was so beautiful, and the moonlight in the sky could not compare to her faint smile. The red wedding dress suited her very well. She sat there beautifully and obediently, waiting for him to pluck it. Gong Dai could not help but walk over and touch her face. So beautiful, he thought, when he really got married in the future, his royal sister would definitely look like this. So beautiful that it made him drunk. Unfortunately, no matter how realistic this environment was, Gong Dai could not forget that his royal sister was unconscious. He was so scared that he was going crazy. How could he really fall into an illusion? So Gong Dai sighed slightly, and the illusion around him disappeared. His royal sister was lying on the stone bed, sleeping peacefully. She was so beautiful, Gong Dai could not help but lie down on the stone bed. This huge stone should contain the radiation that his royal sister had mentioned, so it could cause people to hallucinate. But he was not afraid, he only wanted to sleep with his beloved woman, entangle with her, and not be separated for eternity. Gong Dai gently planted a kiss on her lips, frowned slightly, and sighed. "Baby, quickly wake up. Your husband can't wait to marry you." He stroked her hair and said in a low voice. "I really want to hug you day and night, be intimate with you, and hear you call my name. We will never be separated again, okay?" He kissed her face and the space between her eyebrows, and then fell asleep on the bed with her in his arms. In the entire cave, the night pearl emitted a faint light, and under the stone bed, there was also a red light flickering. But all of this was quiet, and did not change because of the two people who intruded. The two of them slept together, as sweet as one. Chapter 557. Gong Yimo felt dizzy. She had been walking in the dark, but suddenly the scene in front of her changed and it became daytime. Was she hallucinating again? Because she was seriously injured and close to the treasure, the strange stone in the treasure took advantage of her weakness and entered. But the scene in front of her eyes was so real. This was a clean street with shops on both sides, but there weren't many people. Everyone's face was filled with the joy of surviving a disaster. Gong Yimo was in the middle of it and she had a feeling that everything was going well. This feeling was really familiar. What was it? At this time, there was a huge and gorgeous sedan slowly coming over. It was black and red in color and gave people a very heavy feeling, but the people on both sides of the road were very happy and they all knelt down. In their joy, there was a trace of fear and trepidation. Who was this person? Gong Yimo retreated to the side and let the heavy sedan and 1,000 people walk past her. When it came close, the people in the crowd shouted, "Greetings to the regent." His shout instantly broke the silence of the street. The common people hurriedly bowed and shouted in unison, "Greetings to the regent." Regent. Gong Yimo stood in the crowd and her mind was shocked. Seeing the sedan come closer and closer, when it was in front of her, she couldn't help but hold her breath. A gust of wind came from somewhere and blew away the black veil, revealing the man who was resting with his eyes closed. His eyebrows were slanted to his temples and the corners of his closed eyes were slightly raised. His tall nose and tightly closed thin lips showed that this was a very cold man. Even if his appearance was like the gathering of all the spirits in the world, even if his status was unparalleled, no one dared to approach him. They only had respect and deep fear for him. They wished they could crawl at his feet and they only dared to look below his clothes. His majesty was unparalleled. His dominance was deeply rooted in people's heart. So much so that the people on the street didn't dare to get up after the sedan left, fully expressing their respect for him. And Gong Yimo, when the wind blew away the heavy curtain, she was stunned. Gong Dai. No, it wasn't him, it was the regent. She had returned to her previous life. She had returned to her previous life after she died. Was this a dream? Was it an illusion? Gong Yimo looked down at her hand. It was white and crystal clear. It was her hand when she was 18 years old and not the hand that had fought for 10 years in her previous life. Then, was she transmigrated or was it a dream? Gong Yimo couldn't understand and directly chased after the guards. Then, she realized that no one was looking at her. Even when she ran into the guards of honor, those people turned a blind eye to her. She was bewildered and directly to the front of the sedan and then subconsciously jumped onto the sedan, Her heart pounded as she looked at the gauze curtain in front of her. Is it really Gongju? Was she back? She's a dream's a dream. SS a dream's dream. SSSSSSS. Of a person's is, and, even if she afraid of this, she, tus to her. Of a of her s of a her. Seeing. She wanted to see his face. That would make her feel at ease. But she couldn't lift the curtain and no one could see her. Gong Yimo was a little discouraged as she sat on the mast of the sedan. She pouted and shouted in a low voice. Gong Dai. But to her surprise, a white hand suddenly lifted the curtain. At that moment, Gong Yimo was sitting. Gong Dai was also sitting. But Gong Dai was taller than him. His pair of cold eyes turned and finally drooped down. He actually looked straight at Gong Yimo. Gong Yimo was stunned. That murderous aura made her lean back slightly. Her heart turned cold in an instant. The cold and domineering man in front of her. Not her Gong Dai. Gong Dai seemed to be a little puzzled. There was clearly nothing in front of him, but it seemed like someone was staring at him. He slightly narrowed his eyes and his murderous aura overflowed. This made Gong Yimo swallow a mouthful of saliva. Being stared at like this, even though she knew that he couldn't see her, she still felt inexplicably nervous. Your Highness, what is it? Gong Dai's confidant saw His Highness lift the curtain and quickly waved his hand. Immediately, the 1,000-people group stop. The confidant held the curtain in front of Gong Dai and lowered his head to ask. Gong Dai took back his hand and looked around. After confirming that there was nothing, he said in a deep voice. It's nothing. Continue forward. Yes, Your Highness. The group continued forward. But it was as if they had stopped. They continued forward without making a sound. In order to not let the people in the sedan feel any bumps, the people carrying the sedan were all skilled in Qinggong. The black curtain once again separated Gong Yimo and Gong Dai. Without Gong Dai's threatening gaze, Gong Yimo only felt relieved. She patted her chest. Strange, for a moment just now, she thought that Gong Dai could see her. Sitting in the sedan, Gong Dai also felt strange. He kept feeling that there was someone beside him. He even heard a woman call his name. In this world, there was only one woman who dared to call his name, and that woman was killed by him. Thinking of this, Gong Dai closed his eyes again. He thought that he was overthinking. How could there be such a bold woman? Because Gong Dai's aura was too frightening, Gong Yimo didn't have any thoughts of being close to him. Moreover, he couldn't see her, so she wasn't afraid of him. She simply sat outside the sedan and thought, where are we going? Finally, after entering the inner city, Gong Yimo heard cheers and saw patches of bright red. She knew that there was a joyous occasion in the palace. No wonder the guards of honor behind Gong Dai were all holding things in their hands. Was he here to congratulate him? Just like in the outer city, when Gong Dai's entourage appeared, everyone seemed to have pressed the pause button and knelt down in unison. Looking at the scene, even the emperor himself couldn't be compared to this, right? Amidst the earth-shattering greetings, there was still no sound in the sedan. It was obvious that he was used to being respected. This scene not only made him lose the desire to open his eyes, but also made him feel that it was too noisy. After entering the palace, the noise finally quieted down a little. Although the palace servants also saluted, they knew the regent's temperament. They all saluted from a distance and then moved away. Their movements were very light, for fear of disturbing him even a little. Gong Yimo didn't care about this. She looked around and realized that after her death, the palace seemed to have been rebuilt and became even more magnificent. That's right. Before she died, she had already pacified the Central Plains. Daiyu State became the only country in the Central Plains. Its territory was the largest in the world. Such a great country, although it had experienced war and had many things to do, its domineering aura had already shocked the world. It was inviolable. And at this moment, the palace was decorated with lanterns and colored banners. There was only one possibility. Gong Che was about to be conferred the title of Empress. Chapter 558. It goes without saying who he wants to confer the title to. Gong Yimo's expression was somewhat conflicted, but her heart had already let go. Originally, she thought that this scene would make her hate it to no end, but now that she was facing it, she felt incomparably relieved. In her previous life, Gong Che liked a gentle woman like Su Miaolan. In this life, why did he want to provoke her? Gong Yimo slightly sighed. And in this sigh, she witnessed all of this as a bystander. The coronation ceremony was very grand, but Gong Che did not appear. Gong Yimo heard people talking. It seemed that the emperor's illness had worsened again. Gong Yimo felt a bit strange. She remembered that Gong Che's body, after the hidden illness was cured, was no longer a problem. When she heard the announcement of the coronation ceremony, she also knew that this was the spring-summer of the year after her death. In just half a year, Gong Che had fallen ill and could not even participate in the coronation ceremony. Gong Yimo glanced at the ambitious man beside her. At this moment, he was sitting on the high platform, cold and domineering. No one dared to peek at his sacred face. Then, was all of this done by him? After killing Gong Che and becoming the emperor, he could openly be together with Su Miaolan? Gong Dai suddenly frowned, and the people standing beside him immediately became fearful. "Your Highness, what orders do you have?" The newly appointed minister of the imperial household asked with a face full of smiles, constantly wondering if he did something wrong. Gong Dai frowned. Nothing. His 5 senses were naturally sharp. Just now, he clearly felt that someone was looking at him. This feeling could not be wrong, but with so many people around him, who dared to raise their heads and look at him directly? Was it an illusion again? The coronation ceremony continued. Gong Dai looked at the graceful and luxurious figure slowly walking up the stairs, and his heart was filled with irritation. Gong Che was not here, but this woman could still smile so happily. It could be seen that in her heart, there was only ambition and power, nothing else. Su Miaolan raised her head and saw Gong Dai sitting at the very top. It was clearly the coronation ceremony hall, but he was still the person with the highest status present. The courtiers knelt down in worship, and chants rang out in the air. He didn't care about such a grand occasion, and his expression was still cold. After the merger of the 4 countries, Daiyu State had a vast territory. Countless countries from other regions paid their respects, and the East was the most powerful. Gong Dai had a high status in Daiyu State. He was not at all inferior to the emperor. Everyone could only look up to him. The only person who could make him treat her differently was herself. Su Miaolan pursed her lips and smiled. After today, she would be the most honorable empress in history. Not only did she gain the emperor's favor, but she also won the regent's heart. He had really tortured that bitch to death because of her word. What Gong Yimo didn't know was that every time the torture was inflicted on her body, she was watching from the dark room. She watched how the supreme woman was beaten into the dust. Her heart was so fanatical that she couldn't control herself. And all of this was because of this man's love for her. Su Miaolan looked at the high and mighty Gong Dai with her charming eyes and approached him step by step. The emperor wasn't here, so the coronation ceremony should have been presided over by the regent. However, the regent said that he was tired, so the ceremony was presided over by a rank 1 cabinet minister. However, Su Miaolan unconsciously walked towards Gong Dai. She wanted to let the world know that the 2 most outstanding men in the world were both hers. Gong Dai's body was filled with an uncontrollable murderous aura. However, he was used to being cold, so others didn't feel anything different. On the contrary, Gong Yimo saw Su Miaolan walking towards him step by step. With every step she took, Gong Dai became colder. She had a smile on her face. She was able to reach her current height by stepping on Gong Yimo's bones and flesh. Gong Yimo was a little unhappy, but Gong Dai suddenly burst out with a chill. Gong Yimo was a little puzzled. Didn't Gong Dai like Su Miaolan? Before she died, she often saw the 2 of them being intimate. Why did Gong Dai seem to be very dissatisfied with Su Miaolan less than half a year after her death? Looking at Su Miaolan's outstretched hand towards Gong Dai, Gong Yimo was inexplicably worried about the gemstone-covered hand. She always had a feeling that Gong Dai would cut off that hand. Gong Dai, Su Miaolan stretched out her hand for a long time. The tens of thousands of people kneeling below lowered their heads. They knew that this scene was very inappropriate, but the emperor was seriously ill and the regent was in charge. They didn't dare to say anything. They could only endure the new empress hooking up with the regent in front of them. Su Miaolan had a smile on her face. She was in her 30s, but she looked like a 16-year-old girl. She stretched out her hand towards Gong Dai, but saw that Gong Dai didn't take it. She thought that he was concerned about her reputation, so she couldn't help but laugh. "Your Highness, His Majesty is seriously ill. Would Your Highness please accompany this concubine on this road?" Gong Yimo clearly saw that Gong Dai was sneering. It was a sneer without a trace of warmth, making people shudder. Su Miaolan thought it was normal. Gong Dai was cold on the outside but warm on the inside. Although he was always so cold to her, in fact, if she wanted something, as long as she asked, Gong Dai would definitely give it to her. Who knew that Gong Dai would actually refuse? This is unreasonable. "Your Highness, please have some self-respect." Gong Dai's voice was different from the clear and melodious voice that Gong Yimo was used to. In this life, Gong Dai's throat had been poisoned before, so every time he opened his mouth, his throat felt like it was being scraped by a blade. It sounded a bit dull and harsh. When he said one or two words, it was hard to tell. But after a while, everyone could hear how uncomfortable Gong Dai was. Others felt that it was unpleasant to hear, but they didn't dare to say it. However, when Gong Yimo heard it, she felt a bit of heartache. Then she laughed. In this life, the regent had limitless prospects. Why would he need her heartache? Su Miaolan only thought that Gong Dai was thinking about her reputation, so she wasn't angry at being refused. Instead, she moved closer and whispered, "Your Highness, this concubine is now the Empress, but His Majesty is seriously ill. He definitely won't come tonight. This concubine can't sleep tonight. Is Your Highness willing to accompany this concubine for a chat?" When Gong Yimo heard Su Miaolan's naked invitation, she subconsciously looked at Gong Dai. However, all she saw was Gong Dai smiling coldly. That pair of black jade eyes seemed to be able to quench out ice dregs. "All right." Unexpectedly, Gong Dai agreed. Su Miaolan was overjoyed. Only the heavens knew that although this man liked her, he had always endured it for her and never touched her. Now that Gong Che was seriously ill and couldn't make it, she unconsciously changed her mind. She wanted to completely conquer this man. The previous few times, Gong Dai had refused. She didn't expect that he would agree today. Su Miaolan was overjoyed. She lowered her head and smiled. "Then tonight, this concubine will welcome Your Highness with good wine." Gong Dai closed his eyes and no longer looked at her. However, the cold smile on his lips gave Gong Yimo a strange feeling. It seemed that this matter wasn't as simple as it seemed on the surface. Tonight, something would definitely happen. Chapter 559. The coronation ceremony was still going on. Gong Yimo looked at Su Miaolan as she ascended the throne. Even though it was only her coronation ceremony, she still smiled proudly. Tens of thousands of people congratulated her. The momentum was great, but it inexplicably gave people a depressing feeling. Su Miaolan didn't care. After all, from today on, she was the entire Daiyu state. No, she was the most honorable woman in the world. What Gong Yimo? So what if her cavalry trampled all over the 4 countries? So what if she pacified the country? Wasn't it just making a wedding dress for her glory today? Under her instructions, the history books would only record Gong Yimo as an ambitious woman who died miserably in the end. And she, Su Miaolan, she would be the first and most outstanding virtuous empress of the Great Yu dynasty. The 2 most outstanding men in the world both liked her. Su Miaolan's gaze couldn't help but fall on Gong Dai. That handsome man could gather all the light even if he just sat there. How could she not be proud? The high and mighty emperor could abandon Gong Yimo for her, and the honorable prince regent could kill Gong Yimo for her. As long as she was here, the glory-crowned Gong Yimo would no longer exist. In a few years, people would only curse Gong Yimo. She was the cloud in the sky, and Gong Yimo was the mud on the ground. She would forever be trampled on by the world. Su Miaolan's gaze made Gong Dai feel disgusted. He suddenly stood up. When he stood up, the ceremony that was going on was suddenly interrupted. Gong Dai didn't say anything and just left with a flick of his sleeves. The people who were left behind were confused. What was going on? Didn't the Prince Regent admire the Empress? Why did he suddenly leave on such a day? Su Miaolan's smile froze on her face, but she soon thought that Gong Dai might not want to see her become someone else's empress, so he was jealous. She smiled and said loudly, "The prince is unwell, so he will leave first. The coronation ceremony will continue." "Yes, Empress." The cabinet minister at the side humbly agreed, but in his heart, he looked down on Su Miaolan. At that time, in order to marry His Majesty, this woman had used up all her tricks. Now that His Majesty was still ill, she had hooked up with the regent. Why would such a cold-hearted person like the regent treat Su Miaolan differently? However, considering the deterrence of the emperor and the prince regent, everyone could only swallow their disdain for Su Miaolan in their hearts and didn't dare to say a word. When Gong Yimo saw that Gong Dai had left, she wasn't in the mood to stay and watch Su Miaolan's performance. Therefore, she quickly followed Gong Dai and left. As soon as Gong Dai left, many of the old officials also left. This caused Su Miaolan's face to twist in anger. She memorized the names of those stubborn old fogies and planned to tell them to Gong Dai next time so that he could teach them a lesson. Those old officials were the remnants of the previous dynasty. At this time, they really couldn't stand Su Miaolan's behavior. One of the old officials sighed, "I don't know what His Majesty is thinking. The former empress was such a good person." He shook his head. Compared to Gong Yimo's righteousness, intelligence, and courage, this Su Miaolan was far worse. At this time, another old imperial tutor in his 80s shook his head and said, "Who hasn't been confused?" He squinted his old eyes and looked in the direction of the main hall. He sighed softly. His Majesty listened to slanderous words, and thought that the former empress was ambitious. This person, if one person said it in your ear, you wouldn't believe it. However, if many people said it, sigh. He shook his head and the old officials left together. Their backs were somewhat bleak. Gong Dai's pace was fast. Those people behind him tried to keep up with his pace, but they saw him stop. "Get lost," Gong Dai said in a deep voice. That hoarse and harsh voice shocked everyone present. It was as if an ice-cold knife had scraped their bodies. They hurriedly knelt down in fear and didn't dare to follow him anymore. Gong Yimo was also shocked. However, she wasn't afraid that Gong Dai couldn't see her. She followed Gong Dai and found that Gong Dai had gone directly to the main hall, Jiaoyang Hall. Gong Yimo looked at this place with some nostalgia. The entire palace had been expanded, but the only thing that hadn't changed was Jiaoyang Hall. All the previous emperors had lived here, so Gong Che also lived here. She couldn't tell what she was feeling. She had mixed feelings about seeing Gong Che soon. Originally, she thought that she hated him, but she found that she didn't have the desire to hate. Love, hate, whatever, seemed to have been let go and faded away. Therefore, she followed Gong Dai's footsteps and headed towards Jiaoyang Hall. She felt as if she was visiting an old friend who had deep entanglements many years later. Jiaoyang Hall was more magnificent than before. After experiencing internal strife and foreign wars, this hall had also begun to fade away. However, now that it had been refurbished, it didn't give off the feeling of showing off its abilities. It was as if it was growing like a person. Under the magnificent and domineering exterior, it wasn't luxurious. Instead, it was settled down, heavy, and steady. Its exterior was new and old and new. It was like the decline and rise of a dynasty, witnessing generation after generation of proud sons of the heavens. There was a profound silence. Gong Yimo walked within and her mood became tranquil. She even felt a little satisfied. She was satisfied with the neat golden bricks under her feet and the exquisite dragon on the wall. It turned out that in her previous life, not only had she created a bloody debt, but she had also laid the foundation for a prosperous era. She believed that as long as there was no more internal strife, in 10 years, Dayu State would be the most powerful country in the world. Moreover, the rise of the Communist Party not only showed the military strength of Dayu State, but it also promoted industrial development. Perhaps in a century, Dayu State would become the first industrial power. No one would dare to spy on this Eastern dragon, because it was hundreds of years ahead of the world. And it would continue to be so. Therefore, at that moment, Gong Yimo finally felt a little better. After returning from the battlefield in her previous life, she seemed to have been traumatized. Therefore, she was always immersed in killing. In her dreams at night, she would always dream of a bloody death. Therefore, in her previous life, she was disheartened after taking off her armor. Now, the trauma in her heart had mostly healed in the other world. When she returned, she could finally look at her life objectively. In her short 30 years in this space, she represented a dark and chaotic era. She ended this era with her own hands and used war to develop the world. Then, with her death, she tore away the blood-stained history and ushered in a brand new page of this era. Perhaps the heavens pitied her and allowed her soul to return to this world in this dreamlike state. It had to be said that in the depths of her heart, the anger that had been suppressed and buried had been smoothed out. Whether it was the pain of betrayal, the nightmares of destruction, the anger that couldn't be vented, or the helplessness and hatred that couldn't be explained, they all seemed to have been slightly released. As for the rest, perhaps with enough time, she would be able to completely forget about it. When the palace servants saw Gong Dai arrive, they all hurriedly bowed. Gong Dai's face was cold, and he didn't look sideways. He went straight to the emperor's bedroom, but he was stopped by someone. Chapter 560. Gong Yimo remembered that he was Gong Che's advisor, Shui Yang. He was highly valued by Gong Che in this life. Your Highness. His Majesty is still resting. He stood in front of Gong Dai. He was the only one who dared to stop Gong Dai. Gong Dai narrowed his eyes, looked at him, and sneered. Get lost. Shui Yang acted as if he didn't hear anything. He had a smile on his face as he said humbly, Your Highness, can't you wait for a few days? He sounded as if Gong Che only had a few days left to live. Gong Yimo was a little shocked. This person, he didn't seem to be that loyal to Gong Che. He could still smile and say such things when the emperor was seriously ill. She watched from the side and suddenly felt that after she returned from the battlefield in her previous life, she didn't pay attention to these things because of the trauma in her heart. Now, it seemed that there were problems everywhere. Gong Ju faintly stared at Shui Yang. At this time, his identity as the great regent and his imposing manner could make everyone tremble. Shui Yang was no exception. He was finally defeated by Gong Ju's gaze. Your Highness, please don't provoke His Majesty anymore. He finally lowered his head and said on the ground. Gong Dai couldn't be bothered to look at him again. He directly pushed the door open and entered. A strong smell of medicine hit them in the face, causing Gong Yimo to frown. Gong Dai acted as if he didn't smell it and walked straight into the room. On the luxurious dragon bed, Gong Che was originally resting with his eyes closed. When he heard that someone had come, he wasn't surprised. When he opened his eyes and looked at Gong Dai, his eyes were filled with the aura of death. Gong Yimo finally saw the Gong Che of this life. She panicked and covered her mouth. It had only been half a year, why was he so haggard? Gong Yimo looked at Gong Dai in bewilderment. Could it be that Gong Dai really wanted to become the emperor, so he secretly poisoned Gong Che? It was no wonder that Gong Yimo would think this way. Gong Che was really too scary right now. He was in his 30s, which was supposed to be the golden age of a man. But what about him? Half of his black hair had turned white, and his originally gentle and handsome face was pale and dispirited. His eyes were dim, and he was emaciated. There was no sign of life in him at all. Gong Yimo suddenly understood why Shui Yang said that before. Gong Che's heart was already dead. Now that he was alive, he was just a walking corpse. If he continued like this, he might not be able to live for long. No matter how many good medicines he had, it would be useless. Are you here, to see if I'm dead? Seeing Gong Dai, Gong Che still had some desire to speak. But that desire came from hatred. Gong Dai sat down on a mahogany chair at the side and poured himself a cup of tea. After tonight, these people who were in his way would all disappear. So he had a rare moment of patience and came to see Gong Che out of kindness. At least looking at his dying appearance was more comfortable than looking at Su Miaolan's disgusting face. Gong Dai didn't speak, but Gong Che was already used to it. This was because Gong Dai's throat hurt as if it was being cut by a knife when he spoke. Previously, he was secretly proud that he could recover from his hidden illness, but Gong Dai's throat would never recover for the rest of his life. When Gong Che thought of this, he suddenly remembered the woman who accompanied him when he recovered from his hidden illness. His throat suddenly tasted something fishy. His eyes were bloodshot, and he slowly swallowed the mouthful of blood. Gong Dai, seeing me like this, you must be very proud of yourself, right? Gong Che chuckled. In his eyes, there was undisguised hatred. But even if I can't recover, I still have a child. That child was adopted by Moa and personally raised by her side. Those who went through life and death with Moa will support him and be loyal to him. There was a hint of pride between his brows. In addition, my subordinates will wholeheartedly support him. You can only be the regent for the rest of your life. Speaking of that child, Gong Yimo still remembered that he was probably 13 years old now. He was an orphan she had picked up from the battlefield. She had raised many orphans from the battlefield, and the oldest was Gong Ji. It was a pity that she was always on the move and didn't teach the child much. However, from what Gong Che said, he actually wanted to make the child the crown prince. Was it to pit her old subordinates against Gong Dai and let Gong Dai be the regent for the rest of his life? Gong Dai sneered. Is that so? He raised his eyebrows slightly. That extremely cold and handsome face was extraordinarily handsome. His tone was mocking, but he didn't continue. Gong Che heard the mockery in his words and sneered. He had already decided that during the palace banquet tonight, he would make Gong Ji the crown prince in front of everyone. At that time, the expression on Gong Dai's face would definitely be very nice. It's strange to say. Gong Dai's hoarse and piercing voice sounded in a low voice. He sized up Gong Che from head to toe. This prince didn't do anything to you, but you look like you hate me to the core. Why? In any case, we've worked together before. Gong Dai was referring to the fact that they were once allies and fought against foreign enemies together. Later, they even took away Gong Yimo's power together. Moreover, one of them was in the light while the other was in the dark. Although there were disputes, it shouldn't be to the extent of hatred. Gong Che's hand on the quilt tightened little by little. A trace of murderous intent suddenly flashed in his eyes. It was as if he wanted to strangle Gong Dai to death on the spot. His silence made Gong Dai laugh. That exquisite and devilishly handsome face was truly captivating. At this moment, he was sitting on the chair with one hand supporting his chin. He was arrogant and insufferably arrogant. Is it because this prince tortured Gong Yimo to death? Gong Dai. Gong Che was suddenly furious. That biting cold aura of a ruler suddenly appeared. Although he was bedridden now, he had been the emperor for many years. Not just anyone could provoke him. Gong Dai narrowed his eyes and seemed to be even more delighted. This is anger from embarrassment. His voice was like sandpaper and every word he said hurt. However, he just liked to see Gong Che's angry look. He liked to provoke him because it made him feel good all over. Gong Che closed his eyes and clenched his hands into fist. Gong Yimo's mutilated corpse appeared in his mind again. His heart felt like it was being ruthlessly squeezed. He couldn't breathe. He didn't want her to die. He just wanted to throw her into the cold palace so that she could calm down and think things through so that she could obediently come back to be his imperial concubine. As long as she didn't yearn for power, as long as she didn't harm others, he would still pamper her. However, he didn't expect that when they met again, it was only her corpse. Incomplete corpses riddled with holes. Gong Che closed his eyes and knew what kind of inhumane torture she had suffered. And in this world, only Gong Dai could do this. Only him. How could he act so viciously, so mercilessly, so mercilessly? Only him. The hatred in Gong Che's eyes was almost tangible. In this half a year, Gong Dai's ambition had grown bigger and bigger. He had been constantly making arrangements to prevent Gong Dai from succeeding. Unfortunately, Gong Dai's power was too great to be eliminated. The only thing he could do was to protect half of his empire and not let it fall into Gong Dai's hand. In his hands was Mo Er's blood and sweat. He had to protect it. Chapter 561. Gong Che started coughing violently, and in the end, he even coughed up blood. Gong Yimo's sharp eyes saw a red spot on the handkerchief. Gong Che held it in his palm and hid it, but she saw it. Gong Yimo sighed in her heart. She didn't expect that Gong Che would have the intention to avenge her. Get out, Gong Che said hoarsely. Gong Dai acted as if he didn't hear it. He slowly rubbed his chin, and said puzzledly, you hate me. Because I tortured Gong Yimo to death. But, her death, isn't it because of you? Gong Dai's words once again made Gong Che's breath unstable, and he almost vomited blood again. Violent coughs sounded, as if he was going to cough his lungs out. Gong Dai pretended to be enlightened and said, oh, so, it's because you regret it, so you torture yourself? In just half a year, you've become like this. Yes, the world thought that it was the regent who made a move on Gong Che, but Gong Che owned half of the country, and Gong Yimo's deployment when she was alive was like an iron bucket. How could he let him succeed so easily? Gong Che's heart disease was incurable. Gong Dai's words were direct, and they hurt Gong Che badly. He suddenly stopped coughing, and that pair of lifeless eyes looked at Gong Dai, deep hatred in his eyes. I don't regret it. He was still quibbling. How could he regret it? If he regretted it, wouldn't it prove that everything he did was wrong? He didn't regret it, he didn't regret it, Gong Che said to himself again and again in his heart. Gong Dai laughed softly, you really don't regret it? He said somewhat maliciously, looking at Gong Che's twisted and stiff face with a smile, and suddenly revealed some secrets. Actually, when Gong Yimo secretly transferred troops to Yuqing, it was this prince who secretly forced her to go. She thought that Lu Yi had attacked there, but it wasn't. Gong Che's eyes suddenly widened. That time, because Gong Yimo didn't report it, she transferred troops on her own for the first time. Although she explained it in many ways afterwards, it still made him feel uneasy, as if he couldn't control her. He didn't expect that it was Gong Dai who secretly instigated it. Gong Dai saw his change of expression, and said, when Gong Yimo returned from attacking Yuheng, all the officials wrote a memorial to confer her the title of General Fei Long, with military power forever. It was this prince's idea. Gong Ju's words left Gong Che in disbelief. You. His whole body was trembling. Gong Che still remembered that after the incident, Gong Yimo explained several times that it wasn't her idea, and that she didn't want to lead troops, but he didn't believe her. He thought that it was the result of her coveting power and pressuring the officials, so he gradually became suspicious of her, and the couple fell out. He didn't expect that it was also Gong Dai. It was actually Gong Dai. Gong Dai leaned against the chair, as if he thought of something, and said again. Also, at that time, you suspected Gong Yimo and didn't want her to lead troops to Yuqi, and wanted to lead the troops personally. It was also this prince who told her that you were afraid of her Long Yuan army, and wanted to take the opportunity to kill those loyal to her in Lu Yi. I also told her that since Yuqi was the only country left, when she returned and handed over the military power, you would naturally believe her, so she insisted on leading the troops, and so on, and so on. Gong Dai. Gong Che suddenly reached out to him. His thin and pale hand was like a ghost's claw. His knuckles were white, as if he wanted to strangle Gong Dai's neck. But he couldn't do it, he felt breathless just by moving. In the end, he could only put down his hand and ask in a hoarse voice. Why? Why do you want to drive a wedge between us? His neck was filled with blood, and the veins spread to his face, looking sinister and terrifying. He looked at Gong Dai, as if he wanted to eat his flesh. This prince, drive a wedge between you two? Gong Dai seemed to have heard a joke, and he also laughed along, but his eyes were like a god, looking at Gong Che with pity. You are unreasonable, you are this prince's opponent. What is wrong with this prince doing this? Also, this prince only did a small thing. His eyes were dark as he looked at Gong Che with undisguised mockery. If you hadn't listened to Su Miaolan's pillow talk, if you hadn't believed Shui Yang's conspiracy theories without a doubt, how could this prince have succeeded so easily? This prince only gave a hand to the situation that had already happened. How did it become this prince's responsibility? Su Miaolan said that Gong Yimo was ambitious, and that she secretly mobilized the troops because she wanted to cultivate a private army, and you believed her. Su Miaolan said that Gong Yimo forced her father and others to write a letter and title herself as the Flying Dragon General, and you believed her. Su Miaolan said that Gong Yimo didn't want to give up her power because she wanted to be an empress, and you believed her. So when she came back, you couldn't see Gong Yimo's state of mind, and you anxiously made her a mere figurehead. Gong Dai's eyes contained a trace of cold light, and he smiled and asked, all of this, was this prince really driving a wedge between you two? It was you who didn't trust the person who slept with you. Under repeated provocations, Gong Che finally couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Su Miaolan, Shuiyang, and himself, Gong Che asked himself, if he really trusted Gong Yimo, would those people have a chance to succeed? And Su Miaolan, a trace of hatred flashed in his eyes. Previously, he thought that Su Miaolan was an understanding flower, gentle but not threatening. Although she had some ambition, she only wanted to climb up to him, so he was at ease. However, in the past 6 months when he was sick, that woman gradually revealed her true colors. He didn't know when she had hooked up with Gong Dai. Her ambition was far greater than what he had imagined. This time, she used the name of the regent to pressure him, saying that she wanted to be the empress, and he agreed. However, he had already made a will, that if he died, he wanted Su Miaolan to be buried with him. But what was the use of all this? Moa was still dead. She was dead. In this world, the person who loved him without hesitation, who would do anything for him, who would think for him in everything, was already dead. He was the one who caused her death. Thinking of this, Gong Che spat out another mouthful of blood, and Gong Dai was satisfied. He couldn't take it anymore. But now, there were many things that he couldn't help but want to tell him. Do you really think that Gong Yimo was the one who killed Su Miaolan's child? Speaking of this, Gong Dai wanted to say that Gong Che was stupid. How much fear did he have to be so biased and believe in her? He couldn't wait to push all the blame onto her, just for his own peace of mind. It was as if that person's sins were unforgivable, then he could be at ease with what he had done to her. What a joke, all of this was just Gong Che deceiving himself. Although Gong Yimo's power had been taken away, her influence was deeply rooted in people's heart. As long as she opened her mouth, many people would be willing to sacrifice their lives for her, not to mention killing a child. Even killing Su Miaolan would be an easy task. However, Gong Che had been possessed at that time, and in order to smear Gong Yimo's reputation to reduce his own guilt, he had believed it. Chapter 562. Gong Che suddenly raised his head. Could it be that even this was done by Gong Dai? Gong Dai seemed to have understood what he meant and chuckled softly. This prince isn't that senseless. It was Su Miaolan who took the drug and framed Gong Yimo. Poor Gong Yimo's state of mind was obviously unstable after she left the battlefield. She didn't even have the strength to defend herself. She took the blame for nothing. Su Miaolan. Gong Che only felt his vision darken. So Su Miaolan had already hooked up with Gong Dai that early on. It was much earlier than he had imagined. He knew that Gong Dai wouldn't lie to him because Gong Dai disdained to do so. But, Moa has already become a mere figurehead. Why did you still kill her? Why? It turned out that this was the only reason Gong Che had been brooding and unable to let go. Why did he want her to die? She didn't do anything wrong. Why? Gong Dai laughed at him. He didn't know how this silly brother of his was so lucky to meet someone like Gong Yimo who treated him wholeheartedly. Because of her influence in the military. As long as she lives, she can protect you for another day. Gong Dai's face darkened and his voice became more and more gloomy. As long as she's here, this prince will tolerate you for the rest of his life. I don't know what part of you she sees in you. As long as you're in trouble, she won't ignore you even if she's disheartened. Gong Dai didn't want to be the emperor, but he alone was enough for the peak of power. Gong Che was still furious. But you and Su Miaolan, didn't you already make her give up on me? Why do you still want to kill her? You even want to torture her to death. Gong Dai said softly, you have to ask your good empress. It's all her idea. Gong Dai frowned with some difficulty. In order to make Su Miaolan obedient and help him with some matters, he naturally had to make that stupid woman lower her guard. She wanted Gong Yimo to die. In any case, Gong Yimo was going to die. What did it matter how she died? Su Miaolan, it was actually Su Miaolan, it was indeed Su Miaolan. He had already guessed it in his heart, but when Gong Dai said it out loud, it seemed to drain all of Gong Chei's strength. After Moa's death, Su Miaolan gradually revealed her true nature. She even revealed the rumor that Gong Dai had feelings for her. Before Moa's death, he hadn't discovered all of this. It could be seen how deeply these two people had hidden themselves. Gong Chei didn't expect that Gong Dai would fall in love with Su Miaolan and do such a thing for her. Such a vicious, unscrupulous, and fickle woman. Back then, why did he think that she was pure and kind? Perhaps he didn't think that she was pure and kind, but just thought that she was easy to control. Perhaps Moa was too outstanding, or perhaps he didn't have enough confidence in himself. He always felt that Moa's feelings for him would one day be unable to withstand the temptation of power. Therefore, he listened to Su Miaolan's words and listened to Shui Yang's words. He stubbornly insisted on making her a mere figurehead, causing her to die a tragic death. But in the end, Moa, she had never hurt him from the beginning. She had always been good to him, always. Blood continuously flowed from the corner of Gong Chei's mouth, but he didn't seem to feel it. Those suspicions were ultimately his imagination. If she was truly infatuated with power, even if he and Gong Dai joined forces, they wouldn't be able to make her a figurehead. Impossible. Why had he been blinded in the beginning? Moa, Gong Chei suddenly called her name. Where's Moa? Where did she go? He was sick, so why wasn't Moa by his side? Gong Dai didn't notice Gong Chei's abnormality and continued, actually, you've long regretted it in your heart. So, you indulged Su Miaolan's fickle nature and didn't pay attention to the situation, because you've already given up, you tormented yourself every day and became seriously ill. You've long regretted it in your heart, right? No. He didn't regret it. He didn't regret it. He didn't regret it. Gong Chei tightly clutched the quilt in his hand. Unknowingly, tears fell from his eyes. Mixed with the blood in his heart, they dyed his clothes red. How could he regret it? Regret, didn't that mean that everything he did was wrong? Didn't that mean that he could have had a happy life, with a wife who loved him and he loved her, a vast country, and a child with her? How could he admit that he regretted it? Admit that he was the one who ruined everything? Gong Chei's face became increasingly pale. He opened his mouth several times, but he didn't say the words "I don't regret it." Because he regretted it. How could he not regret it? From the moment Moa died, he regretted it. He wished he could strangle himself to death. He wished he could start all over again. He wished none of this had happened. He still loved that woman deeply, the woman he suspected and feared. Even if he thought that Gong Yimo was ambitious, even if he thought that Gong Yimo was cruel and merciless, not even sparing a child, he still wanted to keep her by his side, to be an idle imperial concubine, to keep her by his side. He regretted it. Moa, where was she? He felt terrible. Why wasn't she by his side? Gong Yimo watched from the side and suddenly felt her heart ache. However, she couldn't cry. She didn't have any tears at this moment. She only felt that her chest was about to split open. If she had known this would happen, she wouldn't have done it in the first place. Gong Yimo closed her eyes. Back then, when she returned after removing her armor, she was already disheartened. She had also suffered many blows, so she often felt that death was the only way to release her. She hated, resented, and regretted it. But what was the use? Regret was useless. People had to pay the price for their own choices. Who asked her to make this choice? Gong Yimo looked at Gong Dai and then at Gong Chei. It turned out that Gong Dai had been using Su Miaolan all this time. Su Miaolan wanted to be empress, so he wanted to get rid of her dissidents. Therefore, he created an illusion of love for Su Miaolan and made her work for him. He succeeded. If she died, Gong Chei wouldn't live long either. Gong Dai stood up. Seeing Gong Chei like this, he had achieved his goal. You still want to make Gong Ji the crown prince? Then I'll make sure you never have the chance to open your mouth. Gong Dai sneered in his heart. In the past 6 months, he had used Su Miaolan to do many things. However, that woman had no self-awareness and sold Gong Che out. After tonight, he would be the only person in power in Dai Yu State. Gong Ji wanted to be the emperor? Sure, he could be the puppet emperor. Gong Dai walked towards Gong Che step by step. He seemed to be delirious and kept calling out Gong Yimo's name. When he saw Gong Dai approaching, he suddenly grabbed Gong Dai's clothes. Zhen, where have you been? Why did you only come back now? Gong Yimo had used a fake name when she first changed her name to get close to Gong Che. Later, when Gong Yimo's identity was revealed, Gong Che began to call her Moa. In fact, in the first few years, he had called her Gong Yimo Zhen. Gong Dai pulled at his clothes in disgust. Sometimes, I really envy you for having someone like Gong Yimo wholeheartedly for you. Chapter 563. A trace of sadness flashed across Gong Dai's eyes, but it was so fast that no one saw it. He thought about how he had been released from the cold palace at the age of 13. He had been tortured, poisoned, mute, and beaten. He had endured all these hardships alone. He had been jealous of Gong Che. They were both the emperor's children, and they had both suffered. Why did Gong Che have such an outstanding person to help him wholeheartedly, to help him through all the hardships? And he had to bear all this alone. Why? How was he any worse than Gong Che? Gong Dai's eyes were filled with hostility, and he was filled with murderous intent. Those who had offended him, those who had harmed him, he would not let any of them off. He wanted to use their blood, to wash away the resentment in his heart. Moreover, what right did others have to have what he couldn't have? Gong Dai left, but Gong Yimo did not follow. She looked at Gong Che's despondent appearance and sighed slightly. He was the first person she had treated wholeheartedly. She had killed for him and died for him. He was also her brother crown prince, and he had treated her well for many years. Putting aside her hatred, she only looked at his haggard appearance. No matter how much hatred she had, it dissipated as if there was nowhere to vent it. It was undeniable that there had been happiness between the two of them. It was just that it had been worn away by resentment and faded, and it could no longer cause any ripples. Gong Yimo walked over step by step. She looked at Gong Che's unfocused eyes as he called her name. Gong Yimo sighed again. Gong Che. Miraculously, Gong Che looked up as if he had heard her. His pupils were focused, and he could not see anything. Why, did he hear Zhen calling him? Gong Yimo reached out to touch his forehead, even though he could not feel it. I've decided not to hate you. With that, she turned to leave. But Gong Che suddenly shouted in panic. Zhen. Gong Yimo stopped but did not turn back. She did not want to see Gong Che's panicked appearance. Her husband, her brother, should always have a gentle and refined appearance, an existence that made people feel like they were bathed in the spring breeze. Zhen, can you give me another chance in my next life? Gong Che seemed to have sensed that Gong Yimo was here. He looked around and said anxiously with a pair of frightening eyes. In the next life, I definitely won't be like this. Zhen, can you still be my wife? Gong Yimo wanted to cry again. She knew very well that there was no such thing as a next life. However, Gong Che's half-white hair once again appeared in front of her eyes. No matter how bitter she felt, in the end, she didn't say anything cruel. She only sneered. Instead of looking forward to the next life, why don't you look forward to being reborn? Because in her next life, she already had Gong Dai and only Gong Dai. Since she had decided, she would not change her mind. If Gong Che really regretted it so much, he might as well be reborn and return to the day they first met. However, she didn't want to meet him again. After Gong Yimo left, Gong Che was strangely quiet. He obviously couldn't hear it, but he seemed to have heard it. He was so happy that Zhen came to see him just now and said that she didn't blame him anymore. But what should he do? He must be very ugly. Would Zhen still like him? Gong Che was worried about personal gains and losses. He sometimes laughed and sometimes cried. It was obvious that he had gone crazy, and no one knew about all this. After the conferment, there would be a big banquet. All the court officials and their wives would attend. The emperor would also appear, completely establishing Su Miaolan's identity. Gong Yimo looked at Gong Dai and coldly issued countless orders. It was obvious that victory was in her hands. It seemed that tonight's banquet wasn't Su Miaolan's peak, but the day he dominated. Gong Yimo couldn't help but think of the time when she was still alive. Could it be that Gong Dai found a flaw in only half a year's time? Those guardians had turned against Gong Dai. This method was simply too frightening. The sky gradually darkened. The banquet was about to begin. After months of meticulous preparation, this grand banquet was unprecedented and unparalleled. Su Miaolan was originally a person who indulged in extravagance. She couldn't wait to announce it so that everyone in the world could come and admire her. Surrounded by pearls and jade, noble women clustered around her. Su Miaolan felt as if she was floating, and her smile never stopped. Moreover, she deliberately drank a little peach blossom wine to make her complexion turn red. It was so that she could serve the prince regent well later. Where was the prince? Why wasn't he here yet? Singing and dancing surrounded by a cauldron of voices. However, because the emperor and the prince regent hadn't appeared, the banquet couldn't start yet. Finally, an announcement was heard. His Majesty has arrived. Hundreds of officials knelt to welcome him. Long live my emperor. They didn't raise their heads, so they didn't notice that Gong Che seemed to be in better spirits. He just sat and looked around abnormally. Supported by Shui Yang, he walked step by step to the dragon throne. Rise. Shui Yang spoke on behalf of the emperor. Thank you, Your Majesty. Everyone got up and sat down. The banquet instantly quieted down. Only then did they realize that Gong Che was very different from his usual gloomy and dispirited appearance. Although he was thin, his eyes were bright. His hands were tightly clutching their sleeves, and his mouth kept calling out two words. It seemed to be Zhenzhen. Su Miaolan didn't care about Gong Che. She only knew that as long as Gong Che announced to the world, the rumors that he didn't appear at the Empress conferring ceremony in the morning would be dispelled. Therefore, she directly stuck to him. Your Majesty, this concubine is waiting for you, get lost. Gong Che suddenly pushed her away. He panicked and said to the air, Zhenzhen, are you okay? I won't let her touch you. His appearance made everyone look at each other, not knowing what to do. As for Su Miaolan, ever since she suppressed Gong Yimo, she had never suffered such grievances. She immediately shed tears. Your Majesty, you've hurt her. Gong Che felt that she was being noisy and finally gave her a cold look. Who is this person? She's so ugly that it makes people want to vomit. Drag her away, quickly drag her away. No one dared to disobey the emperor's words. However, in today's banquet, the empress was the main character. Was it really okay to drag things out like this? Suddenly, a cold and hoarse voice sounded. Imperial brother, she's your wife. Gong Dai strode in. He was very satisfied with Gong Che's appearance. He liked to see others escape from reality and play the fool. How interesting. Gong Che's eyes widened. Nonsense. My wife is Zhenzhen. Don't speak nonsense. She's going to be angry. At the end of his words, he seemed to look at the air timidly, as if he was really afraid of someone getting angry. Gong Dai mercilessly exposed him. Is that so? But Zhenzhen is already dead. She was tortured to death by this prince. Didn't you secretly hide her bones in the imperial mausoleum and want to bury her together? It was laughable that Gong Che was deceiving himself. He said that he didn't regret it, but he was tormented by regret every day. He secretly hid her bones and wanted to bury her together with Gong Yimo, hoping that they could meet again in the next life. However, he was afraid that others would know of his actions and know that he regretted it. This behavior was really laughable. Gong Dai's words stunned Gong Che for a moment, then his face turned pale. He opened his eyes and stared at Gong Dai, as if he had heard something extremely terrifying. Gong Dai stood under the dragon throne with a devilish smile on his lips. Gong Yimo is already dead. Shongzhen is also dead. How does it feel to kill the person you love the most? Imperial brother, how long do you want to continue playing the fool? Chapter 564. Gong Dai. Gong Che suddenly rushed down from the dragon throne. He grabbed Gong Dai's collar, ruthlessly. Very tightly. Those eyes looked like they could eat people. Where did you hide Mo-er? Give her back to me. Give her back to me. Gong Dai looked down at him coldly, his eyes full of killing intent. Your Majesty. Many people turned pale with fright and knelt down, while some old officials came forward to dissuade him. But Gong Che's skinny hands grabbed Gong Dai's collar tightly, unable to pull him away. That anger and madness seemed to want to tear Gong Dai to shred. Give her back to you. Gong Dai sneered. He didn't struggle with his collar being grabbed. Instead, he smiled indifferently. Sure, you can ask the King of Hell for it. As soon as he spoke, Gong Che directly threw a punch at Gong Dai. It was caught by Gong Dai with one hand. Gong Che immediately followed up with another punch, fiercely aiming for Gong Ju's face. It was filled with a deep hatred. He vented all the regret and pain in his heart without caring about his image. It was all because of this person. If not for him, Zhen would still be by his side, still be his, still alive. Two equally noble people fought. The crowd didn't know what was going on, but they didn't know who was involved. Moreover, when they saw the regent, who had always been cold and cheerless, making a big fuss in the palace, they had a bad feeling in their heart. Get out of my way. Many people were afraid that Gong Dai would hurt Gong Che, so they finally went to pull Gong Che away. But Gong Che's eyes were red. Like a trapped beast making its final struggle. He finally got to see Zhen. He had finally managed to forget all of this. Forget what he had done. But this beautiful dream was shattered by Gong Dai's few words. He wanted to kill this person. He wanted to kill him. But before he could touch Gong Dai, he was pulled back by those old officials. Those old officials could smell that something was different tonight. Their hearts trembled, so they hoped that Gong Che would calm down. At this moment, someone braced himself and tried to persuade Gong Dai in a low voice. Your Highness, there's no need to rush. He knew about Gong Dai's deployment tonight, so he felt that there was no need for Gong Dai to mess around with Gong Che at this time. It would be a loss of grace for no reason. Scram. Gong Dai was much more direct than Gong Che. His eyes swept across the crowd coldly. No one dared to approach him or say another word. Everyone in the hall instantly felt as if they were walking on thin ice. What was going on? Why were the two most respected people fighting? And in such a way? Could it be that the sky of Dai Yu State was about to change again? Su Miaolan was already shocked when she was pushed away by Gong Che. In the past 6 months, although Gong Che didn't get close to her, he had never been so fierce. Moreover, Gong Dai's body was filled with murderous intent. She originally wanted to step forward, but she hesitated. At this moment, Gong Che had already shaken off the hands of those old officials and attacked Gong Dai again. Gong Che had learned some martial arts, but how could he be Gong Dai's opponent? It was unknown whether Gong Dai was deliberately going easy on him or purely trying to use his body to defeat his opponent. He didn't use any internal energy at all. Instead, he fought Gong Che hand to hand, using his fists to knock Gong Che to the ground again and again. He didn't show any mercy. Gong Dai. I'm going to kill you. Gong Dai sneered, his fingertips lifting his wrinkle-free clothes. Then you can go to hell first. The situation was obviously getting worse. Su Miaolan felt uneasy and stood at the side, not knowing what to do. She didn't understand why the two of them were fighting. Why would a cold person like Gong Dai do such a thing? Those punches were as if he was venting something. And Gong Che, wasn't he the most concerned about decorum? Why would he fight with Gong Dai on such a day? Wasn't today her big day? Why was she so afraid? It was as if something had broken free from her control. The onlookers were also frightened. They wanted to pull people away, but the two of them were obviously angry. Wouldn't they be courting death if they went forward? Gong Che took a punch, causing the palace servants around him to be afraid. They were afraid that Gong Che would be beaten to death by Gong Dai after a long period of illness. Gong Che panted and rushed over, but he couldn't even touch the corner of Gong Dai's clothes. Why did you kill her? Gong Che attacked continuously. His eyes were scarlet, as if he didn't care about his life. Why? You want to kill her? And in such a cruel way. He had suppressed it for too long. Since half a year ago, when he found Mo'er's body, he wanted to kill Gong Dai. But he couldn't. So he had suppressed it for too long. In his dreams at night, Mo'er refused to enter his dreams. She must be blaming him for not avenging her. Gong Dai was too lazy to say that it was all Su Miaolan's idea. He sneered and said what he really thought. Because she is my opponent. You're not worthy. At that moment, Gong Yimo, who was coldly watching from the side, suddenly felt her heart skip a beat. She glanced at Gong Dai. Gong Dai grabbed Gong Che's fist and mercilessly threw him onto the golden floor again. He looked down at him from above and saw that he couldn't even get up. Look at you. You're just mud that can't be supported. What do you think you have that allowed you to be on equal footing with me for so many years? Gong Dai walked towards him step by step. His black hair moved without any wind. His eyes were filled with coldness and disdain. What do you think you have that allowed you to sit on the throne? Benevolence and humility, erudite and multi-talented. Ha 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 ha. Gong Dai laughed loudly. His voice was deep and ear-piercing. It made everyone present feel a deep chill. They suddenly realized that the regent was about to force him to abdicate. This thought made them afraid, but they had a premonition that this day would come. They knew it when the late empress died, but they didn't expect it to come so soon. Gong Dai stood in front of Gong Che, who was sitting on the ground. It was like looking at a clown. Without Gong Yimo, you are nothing. All this time, this king has only treated her as an opponent. She is this king's only opponent. It's a pity that she was disheartened by a mediocre person like you and lost all her fighting spirit. Otherwise, how interesting would it be to have a hearty battle with her? Gong Che didn't hear Gong Dai's belittling words. His mind was filled with the thought that Gong Yimo was already dead. Even if she had been dead for half a year, even if he had personally collected her bones. It was only today that he was fiercely awakened by someone's warning. Dead so she was really dead. At that moment, his soul seemed to have died, leaving behind an empty shell. Hearing Gong Dai praising another woman and hearing that they were fighting over a woman who had been dead for a long time, Su Miaolan finally felt fear. She didn't forget that she was able to have her current status because of Gong Che and Gong Dai's favor, so no matter how afraid she was, she couldn't continue to retreat. She finally gathered her courage and threw herself in front of Gong Che, blocking Gong Dai. Your Highness. What are you doing? Are you drunk? His Majesty is still sick. How can you attack His Majesty? Although Su Miaolan was drunk, tonight's series of unforeseen events made it impossible for her to deceive herself. Gong Dai seemed to be attacking Gong Che. What should she do? Chapter 565. In Su Miaolan's heart, she didn't want to give up any of them. Gong Che's gentleness and Gong Dai's dominance, she wanted them both. She had always been a greedy person. Moreover, she hoped that with the two of them together, they would be able to balance each other out. After all, if she was popular, these two men would value her more and allow her to be like a fish in water, taking care of both sides. However, if Gong Che died, she asked herself honestly, she really didn't have the confidence to completely control Gong Dai. However, what she didn't know was that Gong Dai didn't want to tolerate her anymore. Originally, he had forgotten about this woman and was too lazy to settle the score with her. However, he didn't expect her to jump out. What a joke. In the morning, he tolerated her and watched her walk step by step to the top, also that he could beat her down to the dust tonight. This feeling was too fascinating, wasn't it? Wasn't it interesting to see someone who was high and mighty a second ago, and now, she was like a dog wagging her tail and begging for mercy at his feet? Su Miaolan, when Gong Dai said these words, there was a trace of playfulness. This woman was ambitious and greedy, but he couldn't deny that she was still useful to him. At least, after sending her to Gong Che's side, she successfully drove a wedge between Gong Che and Gong Yimo. Su Miaolan heard Gong Dai coldly call her name. Although it was clearly the same voice as before, when she heard it in front of everyone's eyes, it caused goosebumps to rise all over her body. "Your Highness," with teary eyes, she tried her best to make herself look delicate and pitiful. Didn't Gong Dai like her? He definitely wouldn't make things difficult for her. "I beg your Highness to give this concubine some face and let His Majesty off." Gong Dai was amused by her. Give this concubine some face, she really had a lot of face. "Your face." Gong Dai slightly raised his chin. Even at this time, his exquisite face was still so handsome that it made people dizzy. "Where does your face come from?" Su Miaolan was shocked and suddenly felt embarrassed and angry. There were so many people around and they all knew that Gong Dai treated her differently. However, his words were so straightforward that it made her lose face. However, Gong Dai's coldness made her feel more and more uncertain. She hesitated and finally, under everyone's gaze, she raised her head and said with a red face, "Your Highness, give us some face when we were young. You can't bear to hurt me." Gong Dai really smiled. However, when he smiled, the entire hall seemed to have fallen into an ice house. The night in the early summer was as cold as the winter. Back then, it was like a vengeful ghost that had crawled out of hell. Those murderous and bloodthirsty eyes. Miaolan was to be intimidated. To meet him, to meet them coincidentally. Meet. Meet him. Meet him, her, intentionally or unintentionally or not. When she to talks, to meet, to her to meet her to meet him, to her to meet him, meets s. To meet to her did. She to her, she to her to her, her, s, meet to her t, to her, he. Su Miaolan was overjoyed. She knew it. No one had treated Gong Dai well since he was young. Moreover, he had suffered inhumane torture for 9 whole years in the cold palace. From what she knew, he had been beaten by the palace servants, poisoned and turned mute. Those ruthless eunuchs would resort to any means necessary to humiliate people. Don't even talk about crawling into someone's crotch. Gong Ju, as a prince, suffered even more humiliation than the lowest class of slave. Therefore, she was the first person to treat him well. She must have left a very special place in his heart. From then on, she would often secretly visit Gong Dai, considering herself as his elder sister. Gong Dai would always remain silent, but she felt that Gong Dai treated her better than other people. Sure enough, when she expressed her admiration for Gong Che, but Gong Che already had Gong Yimo by his side, he took action. In the end, he really sent her to Gong Che. Therefore, she believed that Gong Dai treated her differently. However, Su Miaolan didn't know that Gong Dai had suffered inhumane torture in the cold palace since he was young. His 5 senses were as sharp as a beast. Whoever treated him well, whether they were truly good to him or not, he could sense it. When Su Miaolan wanted to pretend to be a saint, he didn't want to bother. After all, at that time, he was still young and couldn't kill the Marquis's daughter. However, later on, he found out that she was eyeing the position of the Crown Prince's wife. He also needed a chess piece to be placed by Gong Che's side, so he beat her at her own game. Who knew that this woman would bring up this matter at this time? Gong Dai really wanted to tell Su Miaolan that the thing he hated the most was sweet. Therefore, every time she brought that sickeningly sweet loquat soup to him, he couldn't wait to smash it on her hypocritical face. After that, he even threw the food box and bowl away. Now that he thought about it, it was really a disgusting time. The friendship from when we were young. Gong Dai chewed on these words and suddenly waved his hand, drag her away. As soon as he finished speaking, there were imperial guards who came forward and really dragged Su Miaolan away. This action stunned all the people from the emperor's faction, because the imperial guards in the palace were all trained and promoted by Gong Yimo. They swore to protect the imperial power and were the last line of protection for the emperor. However, when they suddenly heard Gong Dai's words, could it be? Could it be that the people around the emperor had betrayed him? Could it be that the commander of the imperial guards who swore to protect the imperial power had also turned against Gong Dai? No wonder Gong Dai was different tonight. Originally, they thought that it was a quarrel between the regent and His Majesty. Even if Gong Dai had the intention to rebel, there were many generals under Gong Yimo's command and the commander of the Imperial Guards. He couldn't have acted so quickly. Who knew that after Gong Dai gave the order, those who were loyal to the emperor and those young generals who were trained by Gong Yimo didn't say a word. At this time, some people who were still in the dark were shocked. Gong Dai had succeeded. He was going to rebel today. Su Miaolan panicked. She was still struggling when she was dragged away. However, during this gap, countless imperial guards suddenly broke into the main hall. Their steps were neat and cold like ice sculptures. Once they entered, they quickly sealed off all directions of the main hall to ensure that not even a fly could fly out. Those madams who were trying their best to suppress their presence suddenly became noisy when they saw so many imperial guards breaking in. There were even some who screamed, but their mouths were tightly covered by their husband. Making a scene at this time, were they tired of living? The chaos only lasted for a moment. Under the pressure of death, people quickly surrendered and quieted down. The entire main hall became dead silent. Su Miaolan was stunned. Didn't these people directly take orders from the emperor? Didn't they swear to be loyal to the imperial family? Why did they suddenly turn against Gong Dai? Was Gong Dai going to force the emperor to abdicate? Was he really going to force the emperor to abdicate and not even listen to her? She wanted to say something, but looking at Gong Dai's cold face, she was forced to kneel on the ground and couldn't say a word. Chapter 566. Her heart sank to the bottom. Gong Dai chose to act today. What position did he place her in? Su Miaolan felt confused. Her glorious past was like a dream. Did she really have this man in her hands? Gong Che didn't seem to feel anything. He sat on the ground as if he had lost his soul. Gong Dai's ministers were silent. The generals sat in their seats and drank. Gong Che's old group of civil officials panicked. Some ministers said angrily, "Prince Regent, are you trying to rebel?" At this time, someone brought an armchair over and quietly placed it behind Gong Ju. The man who brought the chair over turned out to be the commander of Gong Che's inner imperial guard. He had indeed turned to the Prince Regent. No wonder Gong Dai couldn't bear it anymore. He had already broken through Gong Che's last line of defense. He wanted to force the prince to abdicate. He wanted to become the only person in power in Dai Yu state in front of all the officials present. Whoever dared to disobey would die here. Gong Yimo saw the silent man in soft armor. He was one of her former subordinates. Because he was silent and honest, she arranged for him to be the commander of the Imperial Guards. He was so happy that he swore in front of her that he would protect the emperor and her with his life. But he betrayed her in just half a year. "Li Suanian, how dare you betray His Majesty?" Someone shouted. When Gong Dai heard the name Li Suanian, he seemed to think of something. He looked up and saw the silent man in soft armor standing beside Gong Dai. Li Suanian didn't say a word when he was questioned. He was as silent as a statue. The civil officials were even more frightened. They turned to question the generals who were still in the mood to drink. "And you? The late empress treated you so well. She only died half a year ago. Is this how you repay her?" The generals were all cold and indifferent. Hearing this, no one paid any attention. They continued to drink. The youngest general couldn't help but hold his wine cup and sneered. "Each and every one of you enjoyed the peace brought by the previous empress, but for the sake of benefits, you supported Su Miaolan to ascend to the position of empress. Is this how you repay her?" The more he spoke, the angrier he became. His knuckles gradually turned blue as he gripped the wine glass. Once he got angry, the person who spoke was immediately forced to kneel down by the Imperial Guard. He said angrily, still unwilling to give up, "The former empress entrusted His Majesty's safety to you, and you also swore." At this moment, Li Suanian suddenly glanced at Gong Che. There was only coldness on his dark face. He also swore to only love the empress. However, as the emperor, he was unable to do so. Li Suanian smiled stiffly. "He's not worthy. He was not worthy of their loyalty. Yes, they were the people left behind by the late Empress. The late Empress wanted them to protect the imperial power, so they swore an oath. Therefore, even though they hated the emperor, they didn't do anything in the beginning. They hated Gong Dai even more. After all, he was the one who killed the late Empress. However, later, Gong Dai sent people to persuade them repeatedly, and they changed sides one by one. Li Suanian didn't understand at first. When he caught the first person who changed sides to Gong Dai and questioned him, he smiled and told him the reason for the betrayal. He said that the Empress ended up like that because of the regent's ruthlessness, but wasn't the Emperor the most hateful person? The regent and the Empress were on opposite sides. What was wrong with the regent getting rid of his dissidents? But what about the Emperor? The Empress was so good to him. No matter how big or small, she wanted nothing more than to present the best of everything in the world to him. But how did he repay the Empress? When the Empress returned from the battlefield, she was restless and regretful every day, but he removed her from the position of Empress. He swore to only love the Empress, but he doted on a woman who was nothing but hypocritical. He slandered the Empress for being ambitious. Because of fear, he took away the Empress's power. Yes, the regent was too much. However, the regent was right about one thing. The Emperor could only atone for his actions with his death. At that moment, something seemed to break in Li Suanian's heart. His mind was full of the Empress when she was alive. Finally, a few days ago, he agreed to the regent. And the regent promised that as long as he changed sides, he would allow Gongji to be the emperor. So, Li Suanian agreed to cooperate with him. Gong Dai also completely conquered the last line of defense around Gong Che. Gong Che smiled bitterly when he heard Li Suanian's last words. He looked around as if he was in a dream, looking at the suppressed officials, the frightened women, the silent old officials, the indifferent generals, and the cold armor of the imperial guards. There were so many people in the magnificent hall, but he suddenly felt cold, so empty. There was nothing here. Nothing at all. He couldn't help but remember that when he had a headache, Mo would read memorials to him. After reading them, she would give a very humorous comment on the person's choice of words and the content of the memorials. Sometimes she would be frivolous, sometimes she would give a serious opinion, and then he would accept it all. Now that he thought about it, even reading memorials was such an interesting thing. Mo, I miss you so much. Will I be able to see you after I die? Mo, do you know why you lost? Gong Dai's voice seemed to come from the horizon. From last night to now, he was sitting here. It was peaceful in the hall, but outside the palace, there must be a bloody storm. He admired Gong Che's expression of despair. Even though he hadn't slept all night, Gong Dai was still refreshed and full of smiles. Gong Che's gaze finally focused on Gong Dai's body, but he was silent. The bright color of the dragon robe seemed to dim along with his eyes. He had always avoided it before. Before he died, he really wanted to hear how Gong Dai would directly criticize him. Someone handed over a cup of tea. The light-colored glass cup shone with a myriad of colors under the light, but what was even more attractive was Gong Dai's hand. Every movement was so pleasing to the eye, high above and inviolable. Just now, he had given Gong Che a few solid punches. Now, there was no harm in being kind and letting him die in peace. You lost because you were too incompetent. The emperor had given up. It was clear that the situation was set. The officials who had been noisy just now were all quiet now. They wanted to live, so how could they dare to say anything? So when they heard the regent humiliate the emperor like this, they were angry but didn't dare to say anything. They could only listen. Although they heard it, it was the truth. Nearing death, Gong Che was actually clear-headed, and he even nodded. You're right. Gong Che stared at a place and revealed a bitter smile. At that moment, he seemed to have become that cultured and refined emperor again, as if he was talking to himself. I was useless. It was because I was useless that I couldn't stand being instigated and suspected Mo. That was why I felt that I couldn't control her and removed her, made her a mere figurehead. Gong Dai held the teacup and lightly took a sip. He sneered. Not only incompetent, but also blind. Chapter 567. When Gong Dai said this, he glanced at Su Miaolan, who looked as if her soul had left her body. At this moment, her face was filled with panic. Being stared at by Gong Dai like this, she shrunk back and lost all her courage. This kind of woman really couldn't compare to that woman who was like the morning sun. Su Miaolan was awakened by this glance. She didn't know what to think, but she suddenly struggled to break free from the Imperial Guard's hand and rushed over. The Imperial Guard wanted to stop her, but Gong Dai calmly stopped her. He wanted to see what kind of fun this woman would bring him in the end. Your Highness. Su Miaolan's heart was in a mess. She felt that things had suddenly gone out of control. The fear of the unknown made her tremble. Just a moment ago, she dared to swear that Gong Dai treated her differently and that the two most outstanding men in the world both liked her. But at this moment, she suddenly wasn't sure. However, she still didn't give up and still held on to the fluke. Gong Dai lowered his eyes and glanced at her. She originally wanted to hug Gong Dai's leg, but under his cold gaze, she didn't dare to reach out her hand. In the end, she only dared to pull on the corner of his clothes. Your Highness, if you do this concubine is scared. At this moment, because of the fear in her heart, she didn't dare to speak carelessly. Her delicate and pitiful appearance really moved one's heart. Gong Dai suddenly asked with a smile, "What are you afraid of?" He blinked and didn't wait for Su Miaolan to answer before continuing. Sister Su, if it wasn't for you, this prince wouldn't have been so successful. Within half a year, we were able to break through the defenses of the palace and obtain all the military maps left behind by Gong Yimo. If it wasn't for you, Gong Yimo wouldn't have died so easily. Speaking of which, you are someone who has contributed greatly. Why are you afraid? The military maps weren't really related to military affairs. During the chaos of war, Gong Yimo had spent countless time and was full of hope for the future after the country was stabilized. The deployment was very detailed, including the construction of legislation, the establishment of government, benefiting the people, and the establishment of a career. It was Gong Yimo's painstaking effort. Many sleepless nights, she relied on the fantasy of the future to support herself. Gong Dai had only seen a small portion of the things she left behind by chance. However, he was keenly aware of their importance. Unfortunately, Gong Che had hidden the things left behind by Gong Yimo extremely well. Thus, he was able to borrow Su Miaolan's hands to get what he wanted. Gong Dai highly recognized Gong Yimo's talent. It was laughable that Gong Che had treated the military maps as something left behind by Gong Yimo. Su Miaolan had treated the military maps as useless waste paper. The ministers thought that Gong Yimo only had talent in military affairs and didn't value the documents she left behind. In the end, the people who truly understood her were actually her enemies in this life. Gong Yimo looked at everything like a bystander. Suddenly, she felt that she wasn't as afraid of Gong Dai as before. It wasn't for anything else, but because he was the only person in this world who understood her thoughts. He was her only opponent in this world, and also her confidant. Indeed, Gong Dai had treated her as his highest goal and worked on her step by step, conquering her inch by inch. However, her appearance when she came back made him feel dull, right? No wonder after she came back, Gong Dai had provoked her several times. Could it be that he wanted to awaken her fighting spirit and have a good fight? In the end, when he found that she was lifeless, he flew into a rage out of humiliation and wanted to end the battle quickly. It had to be said that this was very likely Gong Dai's idea. In this life, he was a person who liked to fight. He was said to be greedy for power. He held a sharp weapon in his hand, but he didn't have the desire to expand his territory and dominate the world. He was said to be cruel and murderous. However, if he was defeated and died, he would absolutely not frown. His inner self had already been completely distorted before the age of 13. He didn't care about life and death at all. He only wanted to live without restraint. Perhaps it was because of the shadow of his childhood that he wanted to stand at the highest point, where no one could threaten him. Then, he would find some interesting people and interesting things to do to pass the time. For example, watching others wagging their tails at his feet and begging for mercy. The more Su Miaolan listened to Gong Dai's meaning, the more she felt that something was wrong. I'm a meritorious person, she muttered to herself, completely ignoring the disgusted eyes of the people present after hearing Gong Dai's words. Regardless of their standpoint, everyone still admired Gong Yimo from the bottom of their heart. However, this fickle woman took advantage of Gong Yimo's sorrowful state to use Gong Chei's suspicion and Gong Dai's power to step on her. She was really despicable. Gong Dai nodded. His handsome facial features were like that of a god. That's right. This prince has always been generous to meritorious people. After speaking, Gong Dai reached out his hand to lift Su Miaolan's face. Su Miaolan suddenly realized that this contact was actually the first time Gong Dai had touched her. Previously, she thought that Gong Dai liked her and thought that she was special. In the past 6 months, she had used Gong Dai's name to intimidate others. However, she had never thought that Gong Dai wasn't even willing to touch her. Was she really special in Gong Dai's heart? She was different. At least, Gong Dai hated everyone, especially her. Gong Dai narrowed his eyes. He didn't know why, but he suddenly recalled the scene of the martial arts competition. At that time, he wasn't as good as Gong Yimo. After she defeated him, she had a proud look on her face. Tell me, how do you want to die? Gong Dai collected his thoughts and asked with a smile, there are many ways to die in this prince's dungeon. As a reward, this prince will allow you to choose one. Su Miaolan's eyes widened. The way to die in Gong Dai's dungeon? She shuddered. Back then, when Gong Dai asked for the military map, she took the opportunity to instigate Gong Dai to capture Gong Yimo. She also wanted him to inflict those terrible punishments on Gong Yimo. At that time, she was very excited when she saw it in the secret room. But at this time, Gong Ju said that he wanted her to choose one of those horrible punishments to die. Seeing that she didn't speak, Gong Dai was a little dissatisfied and slightly raised his eyebrows. What? Sister Su, you don't want to choose because you want to try them all? That sinister voice, coupled with his godlike handsomeness, produced a kind of demonic aura that made people's hearts tremble. But Su Miaolan was so scared that her face turned pale. She couldn't care less. She hugged Gong Dai's leg tightly. Gong Dai frowned but didn't kick her away. He listened to Su Miaolan cry bitterly, Your Highness, don't kill me. Your Highness, don't you like me? Su Miaolan was really panicking. In the morning, she was still high above the masses, worshipped by all the officials. She was only below one person and above millions. Why did she fall into the dust at this time? Why did she have to lie on the ground like a dog, wagging her tail and begging for mercy? Gong Dai smiled. He really felt that this woman was overconfident. He had always treated her coldly. In order to achieve his goal, he had helped her a few times, but she could find all kinds of reasons to prove it. She insisted that he loved her deeply. It was no wonder that she had this kind of illusion. The others also believed it without a doubt. Because for someone as indifferent as the regent to be able to receive his help again and again, allowing someone to use his name to intimidate others, no matter how one looked at it, it was all out of love, right? At least, that was what Gong Yimo thought. What should I do? Even if I like her, I don't want useless people. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.